My name is Aurora Rodriguez. I was 31 years old the night my father stood at the head of a long mahogany dining table in Stowe, Vermont, raised his glass of imported wine, and told 25 of our relatives that I was a financial embarrassment. He said it with a warm, beaming smile, as if he were delivering a toast at a wedding. He said it while the hired waitstaff were quietly pouring ice water into crystal goblets. He projected his voice so the aunts, uncles, and younger cousins sitting at the far ends of the room could hear every single syllable. He told the gathered family that I had never amounted to anything and that my career was a string of quiet failures. Then he reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a heavy gold pen, and slid it across the polished wood. The metal scraped against the table, stopping inches from my plate. He demanded I sign over the deed to the only piece of commercial property I owned. He wanted to use my inheritance to bail out my older brother Julian and his failing tech startup. My mother sat beside him, nodding in solemn agreement, while my brother hid a satisfied smirk behind his wine glass. They had spent weeks coordinating this mountain reunion just to corner me in front of an audience. They assumed I was still the quiet freelance consultant scraping by on tight margins, living a small life in the shadows of my brother's supposed brilliance. They expected the social pressure of 24 staring relatives to break my spirit. They expected me to lower my eyes, pick up the pen, and sign away my future to buy their fragile, conditional affection. But here is the detail neither my parents nor my golden child brother knew. 6 months before that dinner, I had taken over as the chief operating officer of Thorn Capital. It happens to be the exact private equity firm that Julian had recently defrauded out of millions to keep his lifestyle afloat. He had forged documents, he had lied about his revenue, and the billionaire CEO of my company was already on his way to the house with a briefcase full of asset seizure documents ready to drop the hammer. What happened when he walked through those double doors and called me by my executive title is the reason I am sharing this story tonight. Welcome to Linda Vengeance, where we tell true stories of family betrayal, shifting power dynamics, and the exact moment a scapegoat realizes they hold all the cards. How old were you when you learned that your family only loved what they could extract from you? Tell me your age in the comments and make sure to subscribe. The trap began 2 hours before the dinner. I drove my standard 5-year-old sedan up the winding gravel driveway of a rented luxury estate in Stowe. The Vermont air carried the sharp scent of pine and early frost biting through the gaps in the car's heating system. The house was a sprawling modern lodge built of heavy timber and floor-to-ceiling glass designed to intimidate anyone walking up the front steps. My father, Hector, loved architecture that made other people feel small. I pulled up to the front portico, where a hired valet in a dark vest took one look at my sensible tires and unwashed bumper. He immediately raised a hand, pointing me toward the service entrance near the catering vans, assuming I was part of the kitchen staff. I shifted the car into park, rolled down the window, and held his gaze. I did not raise my voice or argue. I gave him the exact same flat, unblinking stare I used across the negotiating table when a failing corporate board tried to dictate terms to my firm. It is a look that strips away pretense and demands compliance. The valet lowered his hand, swallowed hard, and pulled my door open without another word. I stepped out into the biting cold, smoothing the lapels of my dark wool coat. It was an off-the-rack piece, practical and warm, without a single designer logo. I kept my outward appearance intentionally unremarkable. In my line of work, real wealth is meant to be weaponized in boardrooms, not worn on your sleeve for validation. But in the Rodriguez family, the brand stitched onto your collar dictated your human worth. Aunt Beatrice stood on the wraparound porch nursing a steaming cup of black coffee. She is my mother's sister and the only person in our bloodline who views the family dynamics with clear, unclouded eyes. She gave me a slow, knowing nod as I walked up the broad stone steps. Her dark, observant eyes swept over the pristine, rented luxury cars in the driveway and the hired staff bustling through the grand halls inside. We both knew Hector did not have the liquid cash for this kind of display. His real estate business had been quietly bleeding capital for years. The sheer excess of this weekend was a desperate performance, a stage set for an extraction. My mother, Sylvia, pushed through the grand double doors before I could even reach the threshold. She wore a tailored silk blouse that looked thin and entirely inadequate for the mountain air, shivering slightly as she forced a tight smile. She did not reach out to hug me. Her eyes immediately darted up and down my frame, calculating the cost of my leather boots and the generic cut of my coat. "Still refusing to invest in your image, Aurora," she said, her tone coated in a thin layer of practiced pity. "Your brother Julian is inside, wearing a custom suit from Milan. He is pitching his startup to investors all week. You really should try to look the part of a supportive sister tonight. We have important people to impress, and you look like you just walked off a commuter train." I looked past her tense shoulder into the grand foyer. Julian stood near the roaring stone fireplace, holding a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He was gesturing broadly, laughing at his own hollow joke, while 3 of our younger cousins watched him with wide, envious eyes. He wore the Italian suit, but my eyes bypassed the tailoring and locked onto his wrist. The watch, catching the firelight, was meant to look like a $50,000 piece, but the sweeping hand ticked with a heavy, mechanical stutter. It was a cheap replica. Julian was projecting a global tech empire, but I already knew the grim reality of his ledger. I knew he was drowning in institutional debt. I smiled at my mother, keeping my breathing steady and my voice perfectly level. "It is a long weekend, Sylvia. I am sure Julian will have plenty of time to impress everyone with his ventures." She frowned at my lack of defensiveness. My therapist had spent a long year teaching me to observe my family rather than absorb their venom. Today, the practice was paying rich dividends. Sylvia turned on her heel, her silk blouse snapping in the draft, and led me into the house. The air inside smelled of expensive wood smoke and heavy perfume, masking a deep, undeniable current of financial desperation. Hector was waiting near the dining room, straightening his tie, ready to spring the trap he thought he had so perfectly laid. I stepped past the threshold and let the heavy oak door click shut behind me, sealing out the biting Vermont wind. The foyer of the Stowe estate was an exercise in calculated intimidation. Vaulted ceilings stretched 3 stories high, anchored by exposed timber beams and a towering fireplace constructed from local river stone. Radiant heating warmed the wide plank hardwood floors beneath my boots. Hector had always believed that towering architecture could force compliance. He rented this specific property to make me feel small, to remind me of my supposed place in the world. He wanted to project financial dominance. He wanted to break my boundaries before I even sat down at the table. But there was a detail my father missed when he signed the exorbitant short-term lease agreement. He wired the non-refundable deposit to a generic holding entity based in Delaware. He did not know that shell company was a minor asset nested within the real estate portfolio of Thorn Capital. 3 weeks ago, the lease application had crossed my mahogany desk in Manhattan. I recognized the name on the wire transfer immediately. I reviewed the financials and personally authorized the rental. I knew exactly how much Hector had drained from his dwindling operational accounts to afford this charade. He was bleeding his own dry to build a stage for my execution. It was poetic. They were performing a play of wealth on a theater I secretly owned. I walked further into the grand room, letting the ambient noise of the gathering wash over me. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meats, high-end floral arrangements, and the sharp tang of gin. 24 relatives mingled in small clusters, holding delicate crystal glasses. At the center of the largest group stood Julian. My older brother was in his element. He held a highball glass in his left hand, gesturing wildly with his right as he pitched his tech startup to Uncle Ricardo and Cousin Mateo. Julian spoke loud enough for the entire room to hear, painting a picture of global expansion and imminent buyouts. He threw around industry buzzwords with practiced ease, trying to sound like a visionary founder on the brink of changing the world. I stood near a towering indoor spruce tree and watched the micro details. Julian was smiling, but his eyes darted nervously around the room, never settling on one person for more than a second. A thin sheen of sweat gathered at his hairline, despite the crisp air conditioning. When he raised his glass to take a sip, the amber liquid trembled slightly over the ice. He was a man performing on the edge of a cliff. He needed this audience to believe his lies because the truth was a fast approach toward federal fraud charges. Julian had always operated this way. Growing up, he was the designated genius of the Rodriguez household. If he brought home a mediocre report card, my parents blamed the teachers for failing to understand his unique brilliance. When he wrecked his first car, Hector bought him a newer model and blamed the icy roads. They shielded him from consequence, ensuring he never developed the calluses required to survive the real business world. Meanwhile, I was left to navigate my own path. I paid my own tuition, worked 80-hour weeks, and learned to read balance sheets until the numbers spoke to me like a second language. I learned that spreadsheets do not lie. Spreadsheets do not coddle golden children. Julian caught my gaze across the room. His loud laughter faltered for a fraction of a second. He quickly recovered, puffing out his chest and offering me a mocking salute with his glass. He turned back to Uncle Ricardo, raising his voice another decibel to ensure I heard his fabricated revenue projections. A warm presence materialized beside me, breaking my focus. Aunt Beatrice handed me a tall glass of sparkling water, garnished with a single slice of lime. She wore a simple, elegant emerald dress that contrasted beautifully with her dark skin. Beatrice was an African-American woman who had married into the Rodriguez family decades ago. She possessed a sharp, analytical intellect that rivaled my own. She never bought into Hector's grand illusions, and she always saw right through Julian's fragile ego. "You made it," she said, her voice pitched low beneath the hum of the party. "I was beginning to think you might skip the ambush entirely." I took the glass, feeling the cold condensation against my palm. "I never miss a family reunion, Beatrice. You know how much I love the theater." She let out a soft, knowing chuckle, but her eyes remained serious. She leaned in closer, her gaze sweeping over the extravagant floral centerpieces and the hired waitstaff carrying silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. "Hector is overplaying his hand today, Aurora. Something is wrong." I came downstairs early this morning to get tea, and I heard him in the study. He was pacing the floor, making desperate phone calls. He sounded like a man begging for an extension. I took a slow sip of the sparkling water, letting the sharp carbonation clear my throat. "He is running out of road," I murmured, "and he thinks I am the only off-ramp left." Beatrice searched my face, looking for the usual signs of anxiety or daughterly guilt. When she found only calm resolve, her shoulders relaxed a fraction. "Whatever they ask you for tonight, do not give it to them," she warned quietly. "You owe them nothing. You built your life from scratch. Do not let them burn your house down to keep Julian warm." "I appreciate the warning, Beatrice, truly, but you do not need to worry about my house. It is built of stone." Before she could ask what I meant, a sharp, rhythmic clapping cut through the low hum of conversation. Hector stood at the base of the grand staircase, demanding the room's attention. He wore a bespoke navy suit with a silk pocket square, radiating the false confidence of an aristocrat. The chatter died down instantly. Relatives turned toward him, eager to please the man who controlled the perceived family wealth. Family Hector boomed his voice, carrying the practiced cadence of a seasoned salesman. "Thank you all for gathering in this beautiful home. It fills my heart with immense pride to see the Rodriguez dynasty united under one roof. We have much to celebrate tonight. As many of you know, Julian is on the precipice of securing a monumental victory for his company. This weekend is about honoring our legacy and ensuring our future." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. His eyes scanned the crowd, sliding right past Julian before locking on to me. The warmth in his expression vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hunger. The trap was opening. "Please," Hector continued, gesturing grandly toward the arched doorway leading to the dining wing, "take your seats. The caterers have prepared an exceptional meal. And once we are settled, we have a very special announcement to make, one that will require the full support of this family." The crowd murmured in polite excitement, shuffling toward the dining room like sheep following a shepherd. Julian walked past me, bumping my shoulder intentionally as he headed toward the head of the table. He leaned in, whispering a cruel taunt as he passed. "Try not to embarrass us tonight, Aurora. Just nod and agree. It will be over soon." I watched his retreating back, the cheap, counterfeit watch glinting under the hallway sconces. He had no idea how right he was. It would be over soon. I fell into step behind the trailing relatives, keeping my pace measured and steady. My heartbeat remained a slow, rhythmic drum in my chest. The psychological warfare they had planned required a compliant victim. They needed me to shrink under the weight of their expectations. They needed me to crave their validation so deeply that I would sign away my financial security to earn a seat at their table. I crossed the threshold into the dining room. The space was cavernous, featuring a long custom-built table set with fine china, heavy silver cutlery, and towering candelabras. Hector stood at the far end, directing the seating arrangements like a general positioning his troops on a battlefield. I watched him orchestrate the room, analyzing his strategy in real time. Every movement was designed to isolate me, to strip away my agency, and to set the stage for the ultimate extraction. The illusion of wealth was crumbling around them, and I held the only hammer capable of shattering it for good. I walked toward the table, ready to take the seat they had chosen for me. The dinner was about to begin, and the real conflict was only just awakening. Hector stood at the head of the table, orchestrating the seating arrangement like a battlefield general positioning his infantry. He directed Julian to the chair immediately to his right, which was the position traditionally reserved for the honored guest or the chosen heir. Sylvia took her place to his left, adjusting the collar of her silk blouse and beaming with maternal pride at her son. When my turn arrived, Hector did not even look at me. He pointed a stiff, rigid finger toward the opposite end of the room, assigning me the chair closest to the swinging kitchen doors. It was a calculated physical manifestation of my status within the Rodriguez hierarchy. Every time the hired servers moved in and out, a cold, sharp draft swept over my shoulders, carrying the harsh clatter of dirty pans and the shouted orders of the catering crew. My parents wanted me to feel peripheral. They wanted to remind me that I was a disappointing afterthought, allowed at this table only through their generous tolerance. I took my seat without a single word of protest, folding my crisp linen napkin and placing it carefully on my lap. The draft did not bother me. In hostile corporate negotiations, sitting at the far end of a long table provides the widest tactical field of vision. From this vantage point, you can see every micro-expression, every whispered side conversation, and every nervous twitch. As the extended relatives settled into their chairs, admiring the towering floral centerpieces and the gleaming fine china, I noticed a subtle disruption near the grand hallway arch. A man in a dark tailored vest, who I recognized as the catering manager, approached Hector. The manager leaned in close, his posture radiating tense professional anxiety. Hector leaned back, a deep scowl breaking his performative jovial smile. He thought the ambient noise of 24 talking relatives and the bright clinking of crystal glasses would mask their private exchange. He underestimated my training. I have spent years teaching myself to filter out the meaningless chatter of boardrooms, to isolate the exact pitch of human panic. The manager spoke in a hushed, urgent tone, informing my father that his platinum credit card had been declined by the merchant processor. Hector stiffened in his chair. The color drained from his cheeks before rushing back in a dark, embarrassed flush. He hissed a sharp command beneath his breath, telling the manager to run the card again, to bypass the security check, to call the bank and do whatever was necessary to clear the exorbitant charge. The manager shook his head, his expression deeply sympathetic but firm. The credit limit had been exceeded. The account was frozen. I picked up my heavy crystal goblet of sparkling water and took a slow, deliberate sip. The ice-cold liquid matched the temperature running through my veins. My father was presiding over a lavish feast he could no longer afford. The cracked foundation of his once proud real estate dynasty was giving way beneath his feet, right here in the middle of a rented Vermont lodge. He dismissed the catering manager with a sharp, dismissive wave of his hand, straightening his posture and forcing a rigid, bright smile back onto his face as he turned back toward the dining room. I logged the data point in my mind. The financial desperation I suspected was not just a working theory anymore. It was an active, ticking clock. Sylvia signaled the servers to begin pouring the wine, holding up a hand to pause their movements. She reached across the table, grabbing a dusty, heavy bottle of 2016 Bordeaux near her plate, and personally filled Julian's glass to the brim. She praised the rare vintage, leaning in to kiss his cheek, murmuring loud enough for the entire room to hear about how much he deserved the finest things in life after working so tirelessly on his tech empire. She moved down the line, offering the dark red wine to Uncle Ricardo and Cousin Mateo, ensuring their glasses were full. When she reached the far end of the table where I sat, she placed the bottle down, just out of my reach. She ignored my empty wine glass entirely, turning her back to engage in a loud, animated conversation with a distant aunt about Julian's upcoming vacation to a private island in St. Bart's. It was a classic Sylvia maneuver, petty, transparent, and designed to make me feel utterly invisible. Before the heavy silence could settle around my end of the table, Aunt Beatrice caught my eye. She sat 3 seats away, radiating quiet grace in her emerald dress. Without breaking her polite conversation with the relative beside her, she reached for the large silver serving platter of roasted duck that was meant to be passed down from the head of the table. Instead of waiting for Hector to serve himself first, as the patriarchal rules demanded, she bypassed the entire hierarchy. She lifted the heavy tray and handed it directly across the linen tablecloth to me. It was a quiet, elegant act of rebellion against the toxic family structure. Beatrice knew the unwritten rules of the Rodriguez family better than anyone, and she chose to break them specifically to acknowledge my presence and my worth. I took the tray, offering her a single, slow nod of gratitude. The roasted meat was tender and fragrant, but I had no appetite. I was simply waiting for the true course to be served. Hector returned to his heavy carved chair at the head of the table. He picked up his crystal goblet and tapped the delicate edge with his silver dessert spoon. The sharp, high-pitched ringing pierced the low hum of conversation echoing off the timber ceiling. The relatives fell silent, turning their full attention to the patriarch. The waitstaff retreated quickly through the swinging doors behind me, leaving the room sealed in a thick, heavy anticipation. Hector cleared his throat, resting his manicured hands on the edge of the mahogany table. He launched into his rehearsed monologue, transitioning smoothly from the jovial host to the tyrannical authority figure. He spoke at length about the enduring value of family, the prestigious legacy of the Rodriguez name, and the immense sacrifices he and Sylvia had made over the decades to build their wealth. He wove a masterful, compelling narrative of hard work, success, and shared prosperity meant to make everyone in the room feel indebted to his generosity. Then, he seamlessly transitioned the subject to his favorite topic, Julian. He announced with swelling pride that Apex Innovations was on the verge of a historic global buyout. He claimed wealthy foreign investors were lining up, eager to acquire the groundbreaking technology, and that Julian was about to secure generational wealth for all of them. The aunts and uncles murmured in breathless awe, staring at Julian like he was a conquering hero returning from a triumphant war. Julian preened under the undivided attention, adjusting the cuffs of his Italian suit and offering a practiced, humble smile to his adoring audience. But Hector continued his tone, shifting from celebratory warmth to grave solemnity. He explained that global buyouts require complex financial restructuring. He used vague, dense corporate jargon deliberately meant to confuse the relatives who had never seen a real term sheet or negotiated a corporate acquisition. He said Apex Innovations required a temporary bridge of collateral. A mere formality, he called it, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. Just a short-term guarantee to satisfy the international banking regulations until the enormous buyout funds officially cleared the escrow accounts. He painted the situation as a simple administrative hurdle, the final, tiny step before the entire family became unimaginably rich and secure. The dining room grew incredibly quiet. The weight of the impending demand pressed down on the long table, suffocating the joyful atmosphere. The air felt thin and tense. Hector stopped speaking. He stopped looking at the gathered crowd of aunts and cousins. He slowly turned his head and locked his predatory, unblinking gaze directly onto me. From 30 feet away, across a sea of gleaming silver serving dishes and flickering candlelight, his eyes bored into mine. He did not ask a polite question. He did not make a gentle request. He simply stared, projecting his heavy expectation and his rigid authority down the entire length of the room. The true motive for this extravagant Vermont reunion had finally surfaced. The trap was fully illuminated under the chandeliers. They needed a sacrificial lamb to bridge the terrifying gap between their grand lies and their impending financial ruin. And they had seated her right by the exit door, assuming she would be too frightened and too desperate for their love to ever walk through it. Hector reached into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke navy jacket. The dining room fell into a sudden hushed stillness. The only sound was the crackle of the grand stone fireplace behind him. He withdrew a plain manila folder. The coarse beige paper contrasted sharply with the fine white linens and the gleaming crystal goblets covering the table. He placed the document flat on the mahogany surface, resting his manicured fingertips on the edge. With a single firm push, he sent it gliding down the center of the long table. The folder traveled past Uncle Ricardo, who quickly pulled his elbows back to give it clearance. It slid past Cousin Mateo, who stared at it like a fascinating, dangerous artifact. It moved the entire length of the polished wood, slowing as it passed the floral centerpieces, before coming to a halt a mere inch from the edge of my dinner plate. The soft, scraping sound of the paper against the wood seemed to echo in the cavernous room, lingering in the tense air. Hector remained standing, his posture rigid, his chin tilted upward in a pose of unquestionable authority. Inside that folder is a standard transfer of deed, he stated. His voice carried the practiced, booming resonance of a courtroom attorney delivering a closing argument. It concerns the commercial acreage in Burlington, the parcel your grandfather left you. I looked down at the beige rectangle. Grandfather Alejandro had been the only man in our lineage who valued quiet substance over loud style. Before his passing, he bypassed his own son, placing the prime Vermont real estate directly into my name through a blind trust. He knew Hector would leverage it to fund another doomed vanity project. The Burlington property was not just dirt and asphalt. It sat directly atop a primary fiber optic trunk line and possessed coveted industrial power grid zoning. It was the geographic linchpin required to build a high-capacity data server farm. Without that specific acreage, Julian's entire tech startup was nothing more than a hollow, theoretical concept with no physical infrastructure. Julian's creditors were demanding tangible assets. They wanted proof of operational capacity. That patch of inherited earth was the only collateral left that could save his forged capitalization from total collapse. You have held on to that undeveloped lot for 7 years, Aurora Hector continued, his tone dripping with paternal condescension. You have done nothing with it. You run a small freelance consulting gig out of a rented apartment. You possess no grand vision. Julian is building an empire that will elevate this entire bloodline. It is your duty to finally be useful. Sign the land over to Apex Innovations. Consider it your long overdue contribution to the Rodriguez legacy. Sylvia leaned forward, her silk blouse catching the flickering candlelight. Her eyes narrowed, zeroing in on the kill. You have never amounted to anything, Aurora, she said, her voice carrying a sweet, venomous lilt. Julian is building a legacy. Do not be selfish. She picked up her wine glass, swirling the dark red vintage before taking a slow, deliberate sip. We have clothed you, fed you, and tolerated your lack of ambition for 3 decades, Sylvia added, placing the glass back onto the table with a sharp, definitive clink. The least you can do is support the child who is actually succeeding. Stop hoarding resources you do not know how to utilize. Down the table near the center floral arrangement, a younger cousin let out a short, high-pitched snicker, covering her mouth with a white cloth napkin. The sound was small, but it functioned as a precise social barometer. The extended relatives were actively aligning themselves with the perceived power center. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and mild disdain, waiting for the difficult daughter to fold under the collective weight of the dynasty. They expected me to lower my head, apologize for my perceived selfishness, and surrender my only asset to keep the peace. Julian cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to appear humble and burdened. He placed a hand over his heart, looking at me with wide, earnest eyes. "I hate to ask you for this, little sister," he said, his voice thick with rehearsed sincerity. "I truly do. But global expansion requires sacrifice." He paused, scanning the room to ensure the aunts and uncles were absorbing his performance. "I need you to prove your loyalty. When the international buyout goes through, I promise I will compensate you far above market value. I will ensure you never have to work a consulting job again. Just put your name on the dotted line, and we can all celebrate this victory together." I looked at Julian's earnest face dissecting the theatrical display. His jaw muscle twitched, a microscopic spasm betraying his deep internal panic. He was playing the martyr, but I knew the terrifying truth hiding behind his expensive Italian suit. That manila folder did not just contain a simple property transfer. It was a loaded weapon, engineered to destroy my life. If I signed that paper, I would not merely be surrendering an inheritance. The dense legal clauses hidden inside would retroactively attach my pristine financial standing to his fraudulent seed round. I would become the legal guarantor of his forged debt. I would assume the institutional liability, shielding him from federal indictments while chaining myself to a sinking ship. The document was designed to strip away my only safety net, leaving me holding the ashes of his inevitable failure. The psychological warfare in the dining room reached a suffocating peak. 25 pairs of eyes bore into my skin. The silence grew heavy thick with unspoken ultimatums. The hired servers remained frozen in the corners of the room, afraid to make a single sound. The relatives believed they had crafted the perfect, inescapable trap. They thought my lifelong desire for parental approval would override my basic instinct for self-preservation. The folder sat inches from my fingers, a beige rectangle promising artificial peace in exchange for my total ruin. My heart beat in a steady, measured rhythm. I did not feel the familiar sting of rejection. I did not feel the urge to cry or scream or defend my career choices. I only felt a cold, clinical clarity. I kept my face an unreadable mask, letting the tension stretch until the air in the room felt brittle enough to snap. I slowly raised my right hand, resting my elbow on the armrest, and reached toward the edge of the polished mahogany table. I pulled the beige folder toward my dinner plate. The coarse texture of the cardstock felt rough against my fingertips. I flipped the cover open, revealing a thick stack of ivory paper inside. The document bore the distinct, crisp formatting of a high-tier corporate law firm. The font was small, designed to blur the eyes of the uninitiated and hide the poison buried within the dense text. I kept my expression neutral. My eyes scanned the heavy paragraphs, bypassing the standard boilerplate definitions. I knew exactly where predatory lawyers hid the lethal conditions. I zeroed in on the liability sections, spanning pages 3 and 4. There it was. Clause 4.7 sat nestled under a highly misleading subheading about future asset reallocation. The text was convoluted, but the translation was brutally simple. It stipulated that by transferring the Burlington deed, I also accepted secondary guarantor status on the existing institutional debts of Apex Innovations. If Julian's creditors called their notes due, and he failed to pay, the financial liability would instantly bridge over to my personal accounts. It was a flawless legal snare. They intended to harvest my pristine credit score and my liquid savings to insulate his fraudulent seed round. A profound, icy calm settled over my ribcage. For a decade, I had wondered if my parents possessed a hidden reservoir of affection for me. Seeing this contractual execution order laid bare on the mahogany surface extinguished that fragile, lingering hope for good. They were offering me a swift financial death wrapped in the pleasant guise of family duty. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or throw the document back at my father. I kept my breathing even, slowing my heart rate. I reached down to the black leather tote resting on the floor by my feet. I unzipped the side pocket and withdrew my own writing instrument. It was a heavy, matte black ruthenium fountain pen, a private gift to myself after closing my first billion-dollar acquisition in London. The moment the pen cleared the edge of the table, a palpable wave of relief washed over the dining room. Sylvia let out a long, triumphant sigh. The tight tension binding her silk-clad shoulders dissolved in an instant. She picked up her wine glass with renewed vigor, offering a brilliant, shining smile to the room. Down the table, Julian flashed a broad, arrogant smirk. He raised his crystal goblet, bringing the dark red vintage to his lips, and took a slow, victorious drink. The aunts and uncles shifted comfortably in their chairs, resuming their hushed side conversations. The collective holding of breath ended. The Rodriguez relatives believed their united front had successfully shattered my boundaries. They assumed I had surrendered, but I was not moving my hand to the signature line on page 5. I uncapped the ruthenium barrel. I brought the fine gold nib down on the very first page of the contract. I started with the guarantor clauses. The sharp, scratching sound of metal against thick paper echoed in the quiet space immediately surrounding my chair. I slashed a thick horizontal line straight through clause 4.7, nullifying the debt bridge. My hand moved with the swift, mechanical precision of a seasoned corporate surgeon removing a tumor. I turned to page 2. I drew sharp, decisive arrows into the wide margins, drafting new legal addendums in tight, cursive script. I was utilizing a specialized corporate maneuver known as a total asset swap. I rewrote the framework of the contract to state that in exchange for the Vermont commercial dirt, Julian would transfer 100% of his proprietary software code, his active patents, and his intellectual property directly into a blind holding company I controlled. I was legally stripping him of the very foundation of his startup. I was taking his entire life work as the base purchase price for my land. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The rhythmic noise of my writing was the only distinct sound penetrating the low, celebratory hum of the dining room. I let them bask in their false complacency. I needed them to feel secure so they would drop their guard and expose the raw depths of their cruelty on the public record. Sylvia chuckled at a joke Uncle Ricardo told, projecting the perfect image of a relaxed, successful matriarch. She glanced my way, assuming I was meticulously initialing the bottom of every page like a diligent, obedient daughter. She leaned toward Julian, whispering something that made him laugh, a sharp, dismissive sound that grated against the elegant atmosphere of the lodge. In my early 20s, I would have skimmed the contract and signed blindly, desperate for a scrap of their approval. I used to spend holidays trying to anticipate their needs, fetching drinks and running errands, just to earn a fleeting smile. But 10 years of grueling 80-hour work weeks, negotiating hostile takeovers across the globe, had burned that naive girl down to ash. Thorn Capital did not employ obedient daughters. They employed apex predators. And my parents had just invited one to dinner. I flipped to the 4th page. My pen dug deep into the paper, crossing out the arbitration waivers that would have prevented me from taking Julian to federal court in the event of a dispute. I added a strict liability addendum in the footer, holding Hector personally responsible for any undisclosed liens on the Apex Innovations ledger. I was building a cage out of their own paperwork. The ambient heat from the grand stone fireplace washed over my back, but I felt perfectly chilled. My mind operated in a state of hyper-focus, categorizing risks and eliminating exposures. Julian sat back in his chair, adopting a pose of false modesty. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, playing the role of the reluctant benefactor who simply had to accept my sacrifice for the greater good. He was already planning how to spend the imaginary collateral. Aunt Beatrice watched me from 3 seats away. Her sharp eyes tracked the rapid, precise movements of my hand. She saw the heavy blue ink bleeding through the back of the pages as I flipped them over. A slow, knowing smile touched the corners of her mouth. She recognized the rhythm of a counterattack. She picked up her water glass, hiding her expression behind the crystal rim, choosing to remain a silent witness to the impending destruction. The sheer audacity of my father's trap warranted an equally devastating response. He had assumed I lacked the financial literacy to comprehend the danger hidden in the fine print. He banked on my emotional vulnerability overriding my logic. He believed his loud, authoritative voice could easily drown out my quiet independence. He was wrong on every conceivable metric. I reached the final page. I smoothed the thick paper flat against the wood, ensuring the fresh ink did not smear. The printed signature block sat empty beneath a mountain of my handwritten revisions. I reviewed my work one last time, checking the legal syntax and verifying the airtight nature of my newly drafted clauses. The snare was now fully inverted. I placed the ruthenium pen down. It made a soft, definitive click against the mahogany table. The small sound acted as a signal. The hushed conversations around the room faded away. The relatives turned their attention back to my end of the table, waiting to witness the formal conclusion of my surrender. They expected to see a broken woman handing over her future. Hector leaned forward from his carved chair at the head of the table. He rested his manicured forearms on the white linen, projecting the serene posture of a victorious king. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of arrogance etched into his features. His eyes gleamed with smug satisfaction. He looked at me, his expression radiating pure, unadulterated condescension. "Good girl," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "At least you finally learned your place." The rich notes of toasted oak and dark cherry drifted down the long mahogany table. Sylvia had just poured another generous measure of the 2016 Bordeaux into Julian's glass. The aroma of the expensive vintage cut through the ambient warmth of the dining room, carrying a dense, intoxicating fragrance meant to celebrate an impending victory. But as the heavy scent reached my end of the table, it did not invoke a sense of celebration. It operated as a sharp sensory trigger, pulling my mind backward through time, peeling away the opulent facade of the Vermont Lodge. 10 years ago, the air did not smell of vintage wine and catered roasted duck. It smelled of cheap linoleum and the stale, generic beer my father favored before he began performing his aristocratic delusions. I was 21 years old, standing in the cramped, narrow kitchen of our old suburban home. The countertops were made of chipped faux granite. I stood near the sink, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the raised gold seal of a premier Ivy League business program. Inside that envelope was a letter offering me a full-ride academic scholarship. It was the culmination of endless, sleepless nights studying under a flickering desk lamp while Julian spent his weekends wrecking cars and failing foundational courses. I had walked into that kitchen with my heart hammering against my ribs, hoping to finally see a flicker of genuine pride in my parents' eyes. I placed the letter on the counter right in the center so they could not miss the prestigious crest. But Hector and Sylvia were busy. They were frantically uncorking a $10 bottle of wine to celebrate Julian's recent acceptance into a mediocre state college. Julian had barely scraped by on academic probation, but my parents treated his thin, generic acceptance letter like a monumental, historic triumph. Hector needed room on the counter to set down his cheap plastic wine glasses. He did not ask me to move my envelope. He did not ask what the raised gold seal represented, or why my hands were shaking with joy. He simply extended his forearm and swept his hand across the surface. My Ivy League scholarship letter slid off the edge and tumbled directly into the open garbage bin below. "Make room for your brother's success, Aurora," Hector had said, his eyes never even glancing down at the trash. "We are celebrating today." Standing in that cramped kitchen, staring at my future discarded among the coffee grounds and fruit peels, something fundamental broke inside my chest. But the fracture did not leave me fragile. It acted as a high-pressure forge. The intense heat of that profound rejection burned away my desperate childhood need for their validation. It hardened my soft edges into diamond. That singular moment explained the cold, clinical detachment I now wielded in corporate boardrooms across the globe. They had taught me that familial love was a conditional myth. They taught me that only leverage mattered. The memory faded, receding back into the dark archives of my mind. The smell of cheap beer vanished, replaced once again by the heavy, oaky scent of the Bordeaux. I sat at the far end of the grand table in Stowe, surrounded by 25 relatives, waiting for my submission. I looked at Hector, sitting in his carved chair, radiating smug satisfaction. He had just called me a good girl. He believed he had finally put me in my place. I picked up the cap to my ruthenium fountain pen. I aligned it with the barrel and pressed down. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the silent dining room. The sound was small but highly distinct, snapping the thick tension like a dry twig. The aunts and uncles blinked, pulled from their comfortable assumptions by the sudden, definitive noise. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the closed manila folder. With a single fluid motion, I pushed it away from my dinner plate. The beige cardstock slid back down the center of the polished wood, retracing its earlier path. It bypassed the expensive floral centerpieces and the gleaming crystal goblets, slowing as it reached the head of the table. The folder came to a gentle stop, resting directly between Hector's pristine white plate and Julian's counterfeit Rolex. I did not lower my gaze. I kept my eyes locked on the patriarch of the Rodriguez family. "The terms are unacceptable, Hector," I stated. My voice was entirely devoid of emotion. I did not sound angry or defensive or hurt. I sounded like a chief operating officer rejecting a poorly drafted merger proposal. I did not call him Dad. Using his first name in front of the extended family was a precise tactical strike, stripping away his unearned patriarchal authority. Hector flinched as if struck across the jaw. He stared at me, his smug expression freezing into a mask of rigid confusion. Beside him, Julian let out a quiet scoff. The golden child leaned forward, eager to mock my supposed ignorance. Julian flipped the folder open, expecting to see my signature scrawled on the bottom line. Instead, his eyes met pages of dense blue ink. Julian stared at the first page. His arrogant smirk faltered. He saw the thick lines slashed through the guarantor clauses. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head slightly, as if trying to clear a sudden blur from his vision. He turned to the second page, his fingers trembling as he read the tight cursive addendums I had drafted in the margins. The legal terminology swam before him, detailing the transfer of intellectual property, the relinquishment of proprietary code, and a total asset swap. The reality of the red line document hit Julian like a physical blow. I was not signing away my safety net. I was legally requisitioning his entire life work. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray under the warm chandelier light. "What is this?" Julian stammered, his voice cracking in the middle of the sentence. He looked up at me wide-eyed, his polished facade crumbling into raw panic. "What did you write in here?" Sylvia leaned over his shoulder, trying to read the blue ink. She did not understand the corporate jargon, but she recognized the terrifying shift in her son's demeanor. A sharp, loud gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her throat, clutching the collar of her silk blouse. She stared at me from across the long table, entirely unaccustomed to such overt defiance. Her quiet, invisible daughter had just thrown a live grenade back across the room. I did not flinch under their shocked stares. I leaned back into the leather upholstery of my chair, crossing my legs, settling into a posture of supreme ergonomic comfort. I rested my hands in my lap, the perfect picture of an untouchable executive holding all the remaining cards. The cold draft from the kitchen doors behind me no longer felt isolating. It felt like the cool breeze of an impending storm. I let the silence stretch, allowing the profound shift in power to settle over the 25 gathered relatives. They watched in silent awe as the sheep they intended to shear revealed its teeth. Aunt Beatrice allowed a genuine, proud smile to grace her features, taking a slow sip of her water. I looked directly into Julian's terrified eyes, delivering the final blow. "That is the cost of my land," I said, my tone flat and unwavering, and you cannot afford it. The grand aristocratic illusion fractured. The quiet murmur of the dining room died, entirely replaced by a thick, dangerous static. The audience of aunts and cousins sat frozen, feeling the intoxicating thrill of witnessing an empire begin to crack. My refusal hung in the air, a direct, unyielding challenge to the throne. I watched Hector's face shift from shock to a dark brewing crimson, signaling the incoming eruption of a patriarch pushed to the absolute brink. The silence following my declaration hung in the dining room like a suspended blade. Hector stared at the red-line document resting near his pristine plate. The comprehension of my defiance worked its way through his mind, dismantling his smug superiority piece by piece. For 30 years, his word had served as the unchallengeable law within our bloodline. He dictated careers, marriages, and financial decisions, using a potent mixture of charm and terrifying wrath. Nobody ever told him no. I just told him he could not afford me. He stood up. The sudden jerky movement pushed his heavy carved chair backward. The wooden legs scraped against the polished hardwood floor, producing a harsh, grating screech that made several aunts flinch in their seats. He planted both palms flat on the white linen tablecloth, leaning forward until his shoulders hunched over the fine china. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar. A deep crimson flush of pure, unfiltered rage crawled up his throat, coloring his cheeks a dark, dangerous hue. Growing up, that specific shade of red meant an impending storm. It meant shattered plates and grounded teenagers. It meant everyone scrambling to appease the patriarch before his temper leveled the household. My father used his rage as a currency, purchasing our compliance through fear. But sitting in my ergonomic chair, observing his physiological meltdown, I felt no lingering childhood terror. I merely saw an over-leveraged old man losing his grip on a fading empire. A few seats away, Aunt Beatrice recognized the incoming detonation. She picked up her cloth napkin, folded it with deliberate slowness, and placed it next to her water goblet, bracing her posture for the fallout. In the periphery of my vision, the hired catering staff froze. A young waiter holding a silver pitcher of ice water stopped mid-step, his eyes wide, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming truck. The staff tried to render themselves invisible, trapped in the crossfire of a wealthy family tearing itself apart. Hector unleashed his tirade. His voice did not just fill the room, it battered against the stone walls. "How dare you," he roared, spit flying from his lips and landing near his crystal goblet. "You walk into this gathering, eating our food, sitting at our table, and you dare to insult your brother? You are a worthless, ungrateful parasite, Aurora. You have spent your entire adult life leeching off the esteemed reputation I built." He raised a trembling, manicured finger, pointing it directly at my chest like a loaded pistol. "I am severing you from this bloodline," he shouted, his chest heaving with exertion. "I will contact my attorneys tomorrow morning. You are cut out of the family trust. Every single dime of your inheritance is gone. You will not see a single penny of the Rodriguez estate. You will die penniless in that cramped apartment of yours." I did not blink. The sheer, tragic irony of his threat almost coaxed a genuine smile onto my face. Hector was threatening to disinherit me from a fund that I already knew was mathematically empty. My forensic accountants had dismantled his private ledger weeks ago. The vaunted Rodriguez Family Trust held nothing but shadow debt and cross-collateralized toxic loans. He had drained every liquid asset to fund the fraudulent tech venture sitting to his right. He was threatening to banish me from a sinking ship, believing he was casting me out of a luxury cruise liner. He turned his furious gaze toward Julianne, using his golden child as a shield against my rebellion. "Julianne is a visionary," Hector bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted timber ceiling. "He is securing our legacy. You think your petty little revisions mean anything? You think your insignificant plot of dirt gives you leverage over us? You are nothing. Julianne is meeting with the elite leadership of Thorn Capital. The mention of my firm sent a thrilling jolt of anticipation down my spine. The patriarch continued his rant, wholly unaware that the chief operating officer of the very company he worshipped was sitting right in front of him. "When that investment clears," Hector screamed, his face contorted in a mix of desperation and fury, "Apex Innovations will be worth hundreds of millions. The Thorne executives recognize true genius. They are going to elevate Julian to the global stage. And when they do, we will leave you in the dirt where you belong." The younger cousin who had snickered earlier now sat paralyzed, her eyes darting between me and the enraged patriarch. Cousin Mateo swallowed hard, tugging at his shirt collar, as the atmosphere grew unbearably dense. Nobody dared to intervene. To speak up was to invite the wrath of the patriarch upon themselves. They watched the spectacle unfolding, letting my father burn his own dignity to the ground in front of the entire extended bloodline. I broke eye contact with my father for the first time all evening. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I tapped the dark screen illuminating the digital clock. The bright numbers read exactly 8:15. The timing was precise, right on schedule. I slipped the device back into my pocket, folding my hands neatly in my lap. Hector mistook my glance at the phone for a sign of weakness. He assumed I was looking for an escape, checking the time to see how fast I could flee his wrath. The perceived submission fueled his ego, pushing him to deliver the final, crushing blow. He stood to his full height, adjusting his suit jacket, preparing to banish me from his presence. "Get out," he growled, the volume lowering into a lethal, venomous hiss. "Get out of my sight. Pack your cheap coat, walk out that door, and never show your face to this family ever again." He took a deep, ragged breath, filling his lungs to shout the final eviction order. But before the words could leave his throat, a sound ruptured the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room. Thud, thud, thud. The heavy brass knocker on the estate's grand front door struck 3 times. The sound reverberated like a thunderclap, booming through the silent, tense halls, vibrating against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. It was not a polite, hesitant tap. It was a commanding, undeniable demand for entry. Hector froze. The air trapped in his lungs escaped in a quiet, ragged wheeze. The dark red flush of his rage vanished in an instant, replaced by a sickening, chalky pallor. His eyes darted toward the grand foyer, panic seizing his features. In his mind, he had just realized a terrifying possibility. Julian's elite investors from Thorne Capital were scheduled to arrive soon. If they had shown up early, standing on the porch, they might have heard his unhinged, screaming aristocratic meltdown through the heavy wooden doors. A man begging for a multi-million-dollar lifeline cannot afford to look like a lunatic. The pacing in the room shifted gears, accelerating from a standstill to a breakneck speed. The false security of the dynasty shattered under the weight of those 3 strikes. Uncle Ricardo sat up straight, smoothing his tie. Sylvia gasped, her hands trembling as she tried to fix her hair. Julian looked like he might vomit, his eyes wide with a sudden, suffocating terror. The executioner had arrived, and they still thought he was their savior. The echo of the 3 brass knocks had barely faded into the timber rafters when the grand double doors of the Stowe estate swung inward. A rush of frigid mountain wind swept through the foyer, carrying the sharp scent of crushed pine needles and impending snow. The heavy oak panels groaned on their iron hinges, parting to reveal a scene that instantly drained the remaining warmth from the dining room. 3 men stepped over the threshold. 2 of them were towering figures clad in identical, tailored charcoal suits, wearing subtle earpieces and possessing the hyper-alert stillness of elite private security. They flanked the central figure, moving with synchronized precision to secure the entryway. But the security personnel were merely background noise. The true focal point, the anomaly that sucked the oxygen from the room, was the man walking between them. Elias Thorne did not enter a room, he consumed it. The notoriously reclusive billionaire chief executive officer of Thorne Capital possessed a legendary reputation within global financial circles. Magazines wrote endless speculative profiles about his ruthless acquisition strategies, but few journalists ever managed to capture a clear photograph of his face. He despised the media, preferring to orchestrate his corporate conquests from the shadows of his Manhattan boardroom. Yet here he was, stepping onto the rented hardwood floor of my father's Vermont lodge. Elias wore a bespoke midnight navy suit cut with exact architectural precision. The fabric absorbed the ambient light, projecting a dark, impenetrable aura. He wore no flashy jewelry, no oversized watch, no ostentatious displays of wealth. True power requires no adornment. His presence alone radiated a chilling, undeniable authority that instantly dominated the sprawling estate. His eyes, the color of winter ice, swept across the grand foyer, analyzing and dismissing the staged opulence in a fraction of a second. At the head of the dining table, Hector underwent a staggering physical transformation. The deep crimson flush of his unhinged rage vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, clammy pallor. The tyrannical patriarch who had just spent 10 minutes screaming insults and threatening to banish me from the bloodline evaporated into thin air. In his place stood a terrified, sycophantic host, desperate to appease the titan of industry he believed held the keys to his salvation. Hector smoothed both hands down the front of his jacket, frantically trying to erase the wrinkles caused by his earlier outburst. He plastered a wide, eager smile onto his face, a grotesque mask of manufactured hospitality. He stepped away from his carved chair, leaving the head of the table unguarded, and rushed forward toward the foyer. His leather shoes slapped against the floorboards, betraying his internal panic. He extended a trembling right hand long before he even reached striking distance, offering a preemptive gesture of total submission. "Mr. Thorne," Hector called out, his voice pitching an octave higher than usual, stripped of all its prior booming resonance. "What an unexpected honor. We were just discussing your imminent arrival. Please, come in out of the cold. The Rodriguez family welcomes you to our gathering." Beside the empty chair, Julian mirrored his father's frantic desperation. The golden child practically scrambled out of his seat, his knee knocking hard against the thick mahogany table leg. The impact rattled the crystal goblet, sending a splash of expensive red wine onto the pristine white linen. Julian ignored the stain, digging his trembling fingers into the inner pockets of his Italian suit jacket. He was frantically searching for a business card, eager to present his fraudulent tech startup credentials to the man who controlled billions of dollars in liquid capital. Julian believed his rehearsed pitch would secure the escrow funds necessary to cover his mounting institutional debts. They both bought into their shared delusion, hook, line, and sinker. Elias did not slow his measured stride. He walked toward the dining room, his expensive leather shoes producing a sharp, rhythmic echo against the hardwood. Hector stood directly in his path, holding his hand out in midair, waiting for the customary greeting between perceived equals. Elias did not offer his hand. He did not even look at my father. He treated the patriarch of the Rodriguez dynasty like a minor architectural inconvenience. Without breaking his stride or altering his facial expression, Elias smoothly bypassed Hector entirely, leaving the older man standing with his arm awkwardly suspended in the empty space. The sheer level of dismissal was staggering. In the high-stakes ecosystem of corporate finance, ignoring an extended handshake is not an accidental oversight. It is a calculated, lethal insult. It establishes the hierarchy with brutal efficiency. Hector lowered his hand slowly, his eager smile faltering, as profound confusion washed over his features. Julian stepped out from behind his chair, holding a thick, embossed card between his fingers, his mouth opening to deliver his rehearsed opening line. "Mr. Thorne, Apex Innovations is thrilled to partner," Julian began, his voice shaking under the immense pressure. Elias walked right past him. He did not glance at the card. He did not acknowledge the tech startup or the golden child holding it. He dismissed the posturing men and the extravagant feast spread across the table with a single, sweeping gaze, categorizing the entire display as irrelevant noise. The dining room descended into a state of stunned paralysis. Uncle Ricardo froze with his water goblet halfway to his mouth. Sylvia sat rigid in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the tablecloth until her knuckles turned white. Aunt Beatrice watched the scene unfold with sharp, calculating eyes, a quiet understanding beginning to dawn across her elegant features. Elias Thorne walked the entire length of the long, custom-built table. Every step he took dismantled a piece of the toxic family structure. He passed the expensive floral arrangements, the roasted duck, and the untouched crystal glasses. He bypassed the center of power my parents had fought so desperately to project. He kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, walking directly toward the swinging kitchen doors at the far end of the room. He was walking directly toward me. I remained seated in my ergonomic chair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not shrink away from his approaching figure. I met his icy gaze with my own calm, unblinking stare. We spoke the same silent language of leverage and corporate dominance. I had spent 6 months serving as his right hand, navigating hostile takeovers and dismantling corrupt boards. We operated as a unified front, an unstoppable force within the global equity markets. Elias stopped. He stood directly behind my chair, his tall, imposing frame casting a long shadow over the white linen tablecloth. He did not look at my parents. He did not look at the 25 extended relatives staring at him in breathless, terrified awe. He looked down at me, a subtle flicker of professional recognition softening the harsh lines of his jaw. "There you are," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the quiet, dense weight of a man who owned the world. It resonated through the silent room, cutting through the lingering smell of roasted meat and vintage wine. "We have a board crisis," Rodriguez Elias continued, his tone shifting into the crisp, rapid cadence of an executive briefing. The air in the dining room vanished. A collective, audible gasp rippled down the length of the table. A younger cousin dropped a silver fork, letting it clatter loudly against a china plate. Sylvia pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in pure, unfiltered shock. Hector spun around from his position near the foyer, his face contorting into a mask of total incomprehension. Julian stared at the billionaire CEO, his jaw hanging slack, the forgotten business cards slipping from his loose grip and fluttering down to the floor. They heard the familiarity in his voice. They heard the respect. Most importantly, they heard him address the daughter they had just deemed a worthless, parasitic failure as a necessary equal in a high-level corporate crisis. The trap they had spent weeks engineering to destroy my future had officially snapped shut. But as they looked from the reclusive billionaire to the quiet freelance consultant sitting at the edge of the kitchen draft, they finally realized they were the ones caught inside the cage. The paradigm had shifted, and the true reckoning was only just beginning. The dining room descended into a state of profound paralysis. 25 people stopped breathing simultaneously. The air grew thick and stagnant. Time seemed to slow down, stretching the seconds into an unbearable eternity. Nobody moved. The hired catering staff remained pressed against the far walls, terrified to make a sound. The relatives sat frozen in their chairs, their eyes darting between the reclusive billionaire and the quiet daughter sitting near the kitchen draft. Elias Thorne did not wait for an invitation. He reached out and grasped the top edge of the heavy wooden chair positioned directly to my left. He pulled it back. The wooden legs dragged across the polished hardwood floor, producing a loud, grating scrape that echoed off the vaulted timber ceiling. He sat down, crossing his right ankle over his left knee, resting his arm on the white linen tablecloth. By taking the seat beside me, he physically reorganized the entire power structure of the room. He bypassed the head of the table. He ignored the patriarchal throne. He aligned himself with the perceived outcast, treating me as his undeniable equal. Down the table, Julian stared at us. His jaw hung slack. The vibrant color had drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He was holding his crystal goblet of vintage Bordeaux loosely in his right hand. His brain struggled to process the conflicting data. The man he viewed as his ultimate financial savior had just deferred to the sister he viewed as a pathetic failure. The cognitive dissonance overloaded his nervous system. Julian's fingers went limp. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his grip. It plummeted downward, striking the edge of the mahogany table before crashing onto the hardwood floor. The sharp, explosive sound of shattering glass pierced the dead silence. Shards of crystal flew across the polished wood. The dark red wine splashed across the floorboards, pooling like fresh blood and splattering across the tips of Julian's expensive Italian leather shoes. He did not flinch. He did not look down at the spreading stain. He just kept staring at Elias and me, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. At the head of the table, Hector finally managed to break his physical freeze. His mind could not accept the reality unfolding in front of his eyes. If he accepted that I held a position of supreme authority at Thorn Capital, his entire worldview would collapse. He had to correct the narrative. He had to restore order. Hector took a hesitant step forward, away from his carved chair. He cleared his throat, producing a dry, pathetic rasp that sounded nothing like his earlier booming commands. "Mr. Thorn," he began, his voice shaking, vibrating with a desperate pleading quality. "There must be some confusion." Elias did not turn his head. He kept his icy gaze fixed on the center of the table, observing the flickering candlelight. Hector swallowed hard, taking another small step toward our end of the room. "You just referred to my daughter as a corporate officer," Hector continued, attempting to force a light, jovial chuckle that died miserably in his throat. "Aurora is a simple freelance consultant. She works out of a rented apartment. You must have her confused with a secretary, an administrative assistant perhaps. It is a common mistake." The silence that followed was suffocating. Aunt Beatrice closed her eyes, letting out a slow, careful exhale, recognizing the sheer foolishness of Hector's attempt to correct a titan of industry. Sylvia sat rigid, her hands gripping the edge of her plate, her knuckles stark white against her skin. Elias turned his head slowly. He fixed Hector with a dead-eyed, predatory stare. It was the look of a man evaluating a particularly unimpressive insect before stepping on it. "Mistaken her?" Elias asked. His voice was smooth, cold, and dangerously quiet. "Your daughter is the architect of my firm's most strategic acquisitions. She dismantled 3 corrupt corporate boards last quarter alone. I do not make mistakes, Mr. Rodriguez, and I certainly do not confuse my chief operating officer with a secretary." The words hit Hector like a physical blow to the sternum. He staggered back half a step, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable truth shattered his false reality into a million jagged pieces. The daughter he had belittled, marginalized, and treated as a disposable asset was the second most powerful executive at the private equity firm he worshipped. The power dynamic in the room inverted with dizzying speed. The heavy, suffocating pressure that my family had spent weeks building evaporated instantly. I did not need to scream or throw a tantrum to claim my space. The truth did the heavy lifting for me. I let my compliant daughter persona fall away, shedding the quiet, submissive posture I had worn all evening. I sat up straighter, rolling my shoulders back. My facial expression shifted from neutral observation to crisp, focused authority. I turned to Elias, seamlessly slipping into the razor-sharp executive mindset I utilized every single day in Manhattan. "Status report, Elias," I said. My voice was brisk, direct, and entirely devoid of familial warmth. I did not ask about his drive or offer him a drink. I initiated a high-level business exchange right in the middle of a catered family feast. Elias nodded, matching my professional cadence. He reached down and lifted his leather briefcase, placing it flat on the white linen tablecloth between our plates. He unclasped the twin brass locks. The sharp, mechanical clicks echoed loudly in the stunned quiet of the dining room. He flipped the leather lid open, revealing neat stacks of dense legal dossiers and financial ledgers. "We have a critical failure in the tech sector," Elias stated, pulling a thick red folder from the center compartment. "A subsidiary we recently acquired is attempting to default on a $50 million bridge loan. The grace period expired at midnight. The founders are fabricating revenue projections and hiding severe institutional insolvency." He slid the red folder across the tablecloth. It stopped directly in front of me, resting right next to the predatory manila folder my father had thrown at me earlier. The compliance department flagged the forged capitalizations this morning. Elias continued, his tone clinical and detached. We need to move on the collateral immediately before they attempt to liquidate their physical infrastructure and flee the jurisdiction. I need your immediate signature to authorize an unannounced total asset seizure. We will lock their accounts, seize their servers, and liquidate the underlying intellectual property by Monday morning. I placed my hands on the red folder. The thick cardstock felt substantial, heavy with consequence. I pulled the documents out, spreading them across the space in front of my dinner plate. The audience of extended relatives watched this exchange with a mixture of horror and pure, unfiltered fascination. The dramatic irony peaked, reaching a level of profound, intense satisfaction. For 2 hours, they had watched Hector and Julian try to bully me into signing a piece of paper meant to destroy my life. They had laughed and snickered as my parents tried to force me into submission. Now they were watching me hold a different stack of papers. Papers that held genuine, terrifying power. Papers that could erase a $50 million entity with a single stroke of my pen. I looked down the length of the table. Sylvia was trembling visibly, her silk blouse shaking as her breathing grew erratic. Uncle Ricardo stared at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Hector stood frozen near his chair, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. Then I looked at Julian. He was still standing over his shattered wine glass, staring at the red folder in my hands. His chest heaved. He understood the lethal nature of a total asset seizure. He understood what happens when Thorn Capital decides to collect a debt. The Rodriguez family had spent the entire evening trying to lock me inside a cage of their own design. They had rented the estate, hired the caterers, and gathered the audience. But as I picked up my ruthenium fountain pen and prepared to review the seizure protocols, they finally realized the terrifying truth. I was no longer the target. I was the apex predator, and they were trapped inside my cage with no exits left to find. I ran my index finger down the crisp, heavy bond paper of the seizure mandate. The legal text was immaculate, drafting a flawless perimeter around the targeted assets. I checked the routing numbers, verified the default timelines, and reviewed the attached digital signature logs. My eyes tracked across the neat rows of financial ruin. The entire room remained caught in a breathless suspension. Elias sat perfectly still beside me, radiating the quiet menace of a predator waiting for the kill command. I turned to the second page, locating the primary debtor information block. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to tear the foundation of the house apart. The defaulting subsidiary is listed right here, I stated, my tone echoing the sterile environment of a corporate boardroom. Apex Innovations. The name dropped onto the dining table like a lead weight. Across the expanse of white linen and flickering candles, my mother reacted first. Sylvia reached up with a trembling hand, grasping the string of pearls resting against her collarbone. Her knuckles drained of color. The blood left her face, leaving her looking hollow and fragile under the bright chandeliers. Her meticulously crafted illusion of aristocratic superiority fractured into dust. To my right, Julian physically recoiled. He stumbled backward, his heel crunching loudly into the shattered remnants of his crystal wine glass. He did not seem to feel the sharp edges piercing the leather of his expensive shoes. The arrogant smirk he had worn since childhood, the one that accompanied every stolen achievement and unearned accolade, melted into an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at the red folder in my hands as if it were a venomous snake coiled to strike. For his entire life, Julian had enjoyed the impenetrable shield of our parents' protection. If he broke a window, Hector paid the neighbor. If he failed an exam, Sylvia blamed the curriculum. They had constructed a reality where their golden boy faced zero consequences. But sitting in my ergonomic chair, holding the authorized asset seizure protocol, I brought the inescapable weight of federal corporate law directly into their rented dining room. Thorn Capital did not care about Sylvia shielding him. We only cared about the ledger. I tapped the document with my ruthenium fountain pen, bringing the focus of the 25 gathered relatives back to the lethal paperwork. Julian did not build a successful tech startup, I announced, keeping my cadence measured and clinical. He built a house of cards, financed entirely by corporate fraud. 9 months ago, Apex Innovations ran out of operating capital. Instead of declaring bankruptcy, Julian sought a $50 million bridge loan from a mid-tier lending firm, a firm that Thorn Capital recently acquired. I flipped to the third page, revealing a blown-up photocopy of the original loan guarantor agreement. I turned the folder so the document faced the head of the table. The lending firm required a high-tier guarantor to underwrite the risk. I continued, locking eyes with my brother. Someone with a pristine credit profile and substantial verifiable assets. Julian knew he did not qualify, so he stole my identity. He forged my signature on the initial seed round documents, leveraging my pristine financial standing to secure high-interest institutional debt. A collective shudder passed through the extended family. Aunt Beatrice narrowed her eyes, letting out a low, soft breath of realization. Uncle Ricardo gripped the edge of the table, his face a portrait of grim understanding. They were witnessing the systematic dismantling of the family heir. The pieces of the elaborate puzzle snapped into place, illuminating the true nature of this Vermont gathering. I looked toward my father. Hector was staring at the photocopied signature, his jaw slack, his chest rising and falling in erratic, shallow bursts. This weekend reunion was never an investment pitch, I said, my voice slicing through the heavy silence. It was a desperate, frantic cover-up. The internal auditors at Thorn Capital began reviewing the acquired loan portfolios last week. Julian knew the compliance team would verify the signatures. He knew the forgery was about to be exposed to the federal authorities. I pointed the tip of my pen toward the beige manila folder Hector had shoved at me earlier. That property deed you tried to force me to sign was not just about the Burlington land, I explained. Buried in the fine print was a retroactive authorization clause. If I had signed that contract, I would have legally acknowledged the forged debt as my own. I would have legitimized his crime. You threw a catered party to trick me into jumping in front of a federal indictment to save your son. Hector looked like a man who had just stepped off a ledge and was waiting to hit the ground. His eyes darted from the red folder to me and then finally settled on the golden child standing amidst the broken glass. The patriarch had spent his life orchestrating schemes, but he always believed he was the smartest person in the room. Now he realized his own son had played him, using the family fortune as a shield for a criminal enterprise. Julian Hector commanded. The patriarch tried to summon his authoritative boom, but his voice cracked, fracturing into a weak, raspy whisper. He took a hesitant step toward his son, his hands shaking at his sides. Explain this, Hector demanded, the volume rising slightly, fueled by a sudden, desperate panic. Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not forge her name. Julian pressed his back against the grand stone fireplace. His expensive Italian suit looked rumpled and absurd in the face of impending incarceration. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at his father, then at his mother, and finally at Elias Thorne, who sat watching the destruction with cold, detached interest. Julian raised his hands, palms facing outward, in a weak gesture of surrender. I had to do it, he stammered, a thick sob tearing through his throat. The startup was failing. The developers were threatening to walk. I just needed a few more months to finish the software. I was going to pay it back before anyone noticed. I swear. Tears spilled over his lower eyelids, tracking down his pale cheeks. The golden boy wept openly in front of the entire Rodriguez dynasty. His confession hung in the air, a pathetic admission of guilt that stripped away the last remaining shreds of his dignity. Sylvia let out a strangled wail, covering her face with both hands. Her tears smeared her expensive makeup, ruining the flawless, aristocratic facade she had maintained for decades. The son she had worshipped, the boy she had placed on a pedestal above everything else, was a confessed felon. Hector staggered backward, bumping into his carved wooden chair. The sturdy piece of furniture caught his weight, preventing him from collapsing onto the hardwood. He gripped the wooden armrests, staring at his weeping son. The patriarchal throne was now just a prop in a ruined theater. The psychological dynamic within the dining room underwent a radical, permanent shift. 10 minutes ago, I was the target. I was the disappointment, the outcast, the ungrateful daughter expected to sacrifice her meager savings to appease the family hierarchy. Hector and Sylvia had demanded my compliance, utilizing every tool of emotional manipulation and verbal abuse at their disposal. They had called me worthless. They had mocked my career. Now the truth was laid bare under the bright chandeliers. The daughter they humiliated held the absolute legal authority to authorize a total asset seizure and forward the forgery evidence to the federal prosecutor. I held Julian's freedom resting right in the palm of my hand. I did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive triumph. I did not smile or mock their tears. I merely watched the consequences of their actions crash down upon them like a tidal wave. The conflict had fundamentally pivoted. I was no longer defending my boundaries against their extraction attempts. Julian was now fighting for his actual survival. I turned my attention back to the red folder resting on the table. The stark reality of corporate law does not pause for familial grief. I looked at Elias. He offered a fraction of a nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of the reveal. He did not interfere, allowing me to dictate the pacing of the hostile takeover. Julian wiped his face with the sleeve of his custom suit, ruining the expensive fabric. He took a shaky step toward my end of the table, his eyes wide, with a new, terrifying realization. He was looking at me not as a sister, but as the executioner. "Aurora, please," he begged, his voice a wet, pathetic whisper. "If you authorize that seizure, the firm will hand the files over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. It carries a 10-year mandatory sentence for wire fraud and identity theft. You cannot send your own brother to federal prison." I picked up the ruthenium fountain pen, twisting the barrel between my fingers. I studied the sharp gold nib. "I am not sending you anywhere, Julian," I replied, my tone calm and steady. "You forged a signature on a corporate loan document. You defrauded a multi-million-dollar lending institution. I am simply processing the paperwork." The distinction offered him no comfort. The aunts and uncles watched in stunned silence, recognizing that the old rules of the Rodriguez family no longer applied. Tears and tantrums held no currency here. The old patriarch was broken, the golden child was a criminal, and the outcast daughter was the reigning authority. The next move belonged entirely to the woman they had spent 30 years underestimating. The stark reality of federal prison has a unique way of altering human behavior. I watched the realization wash over my mother. Sylvia stood near the center of the long dining table, her posture stiff and rigid. For my entire life, she had utilized a specific brand of icy, aristocratic distance to keep me seeking her approval. She wielded her maternal affection like a scarce commodity, distributing it only when Julian achieved a milestone or when Hector required a display of a perfect family. When Julian confessed to the forgery in front of the extended relatives, that fragile aristocratic illusion shattered into dust. I observed the precise moment Sylvia recalibrated her strategy. The color rushed back into her pale cheeks. Her eyes widened, shedding the cold, condescending glare she had leveled at me just 20 minutes prior. She blinked rapidly, forcing a sudden rush of moisture to pool over her lower eyelids. The transformation was swift and terrifyingly seamless. She was shifting from the cruel matriarch to the desperate, pleading mother, recognizing that her usual weapons of shame and isolation held no power over the woman controlling the corporate ledger. Sylvia moved. She stepped away from her carved chair, her expensive high heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She abandoned Hector, who remained frozen in his own shock, and hurried down the length of the dining room. Her silk blouse fluttered as she bypassed the floral centerpieces and the untouched silver platters of roasted duck. She rushed toward my end of the table, projecting an aura of frantic maternal devotion that felt entirely alien to my lived experience. "Aurora," she cried, out her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. She closed the distance, stopping just inches from my ergonomic chair. She reached out with both hands, her fingers outstretched, attempting to grasp my own hands, resting near the red seizure folder. I recognized the tactic instantly. It was a physical invasion designed to force an emotional connection, to compel me to comfort her and lower my defenses. I did not let her touch me. I planted my feet against the floorboards and pushed backward. The smooth casters of my chair glided effortlessly across the wood, putting a firm 3-foot gap between us. Her manicured hands grasped empty air, hovering awkwardly over the white linen tablecloth. I kept my posture relaxed, my face an unreadable mask of corporate neutrality. Sylvia let her hands drop to the table, gripping the edge as she leaned forward. A heavy waft of her signature floral perfume washed over me, clashing unpleasantly with the scent of the vintage Bordeaux spilled on the floor across the room. Tears spilled down her cheeks, streaking her flawless makeup. "You must listen to me, Aurora," she pleaded, her voice adopting a soft, frantic lilt. "This whole evening, this entire dinner, it was just a simulation, a stress test. Your father and I, we knew about your position at Thorn Capital. We wanted to see how you handled extreme pressure in a hostile environment. We were testing your business acumen." The sheer absurdity of the lie hung in the tense air of the dining room. It was a breathtaking attempt at historical revisionism, occurring mere minutes after the actual events. I glanced down the table. Uncle Ricardo stared at Sylvia, his mouth slightly open, unable to process the blatant falsehood. Cousin Mateo looked down at his plate, deeply embarrassed by the spectacle. Aunt Beatrice simply raised an eyebrow, taking a slow sip of her water, watching my mother dig a bottomless grave of deceit. "We are so proud of you, Sylvia," continued, the tears flowing faster now. "You passed the test brilliantly, darling. You are a phenomenal executive. But you have to understand that Julian is just a boy who made a mistake. He got in over his head trying to make us proud. You cannot authorize this asset seizure. You must forgive the debt and restructure the loan terms. We are family, Aurora. Blood is thicker than water." I sat in my chair dissecting her frantic monologue with the clinical precision of a seasoned negotiator. The internal monologue running through my mind was loud and remarkably clear. For 31 years, I had wondered what it would take to make my mother look at me with genuine, desperate need. Now I had the answer. She did not need me. She needed a loophole. Her sudden warmth, her performative tears, her frantic praise, it was all the ultimate transactional betrayal. She was attempting to purchase Julian's freedom, using a counterfeit currency of maternal love she had never actually possessed. Beside me, Elias Thorne shifted in his chair. The billionaire CEO rested his right arm on the table, adjusting a platinum cufflink with slow, deliberate ease. He had remained a silent observer, allowing me to command the room. But as Sylvia leaned closer, attempting to leverage my corporate authority through emotional extortion, Elias decided to establish a firm boundary on behalf of his firm. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Elias said, his voice low, resonant, and cutting through her frantic pleas like a diamond blade. Sylvia startled, turning her tear-streaked face toward the titan of industry. "Thorn Capital operates a multi-billion-dollar global portfolio," Elias continued, his tone conversational, yet laced with an undeniable lethal edge. "We employ forensic accountants, federal compliance officers, and teams of corporate litigators. We evaluate market trends, asset liquidity, and risk liability. Do you know what we do not evaluate?" Sylvia shook her head silently, her breath catching in her throat. "Maternal grief," Elias stated, his icy gaze pinning her to the floorboards. "Corporate debt is immune to tears. A forged signature constitutes federal wire fraud. Your daughter is acting in her official capacity as the chief operating officer of my empire. If you attempt to manipulate my executive officer again, I will personally ensure the federal prosecutor receives the original, unredacted files by dawn." The threat landed with staggering weight. Sylvia shrank back, pulling her hands away from the edge of the table, as if the linen had suddenly caught fire. Elias leaned back into his chair, returning control of the execution to me. I picked up my ruthenium fountain pen. I did not look at my mother with anger or sorrow. I looked at her the same way I looked at a bankrupt balance sheet. "You are lying, Sylvia," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent dining room. "You did not know about my position. You threw this dinner to trick me into assuming Julian's debt. You orchestrated an ambush to strip away my inheritance." "Aurora, please," she whimpered, taking a small step backward. "We are your parents. We gave you everything." "You gave me nothing," I corrected, keeping my tone flat and unwavering. "I paid my own tuition. I secured my own promotions. I built my own wealth, while you funneled every available resource into a son who repaid your blind devotion with a federal crime. You stood right there 20 minutes ago and told this entire room that I had never amounted to anything." I paused, letting the undeniable truth echo against the vaulted timber ceilings. I watched her swallow hard, her eyes darting nervously toward the aunts and uncles who had witnessed her earlier cruelty. The audience was transfixed, reveling in the stark, poetic justice unfolding before them. "You told me I was hoarding resources I did not know how to utilize." I continued, quoting her exact phrasing. "You told me it was my duty to sacrifice my future for the golden child. You looked me in the eye and said you only kept me around out of pity." Sylvia opened her mouth, a fresh wave of tears springing to her eyes, ready to launch another desperate apology. I cut her off. I dropped her own words onto the table like heavy stones, shattering the last remnants of her manipulation. "Pity does not restructure debt." "Sylvia," I said. The sentence hung in the air, final and absolute. Her usual weapons, her gaslighting, her guilt trips, her performative sobbing, bounced uselessly off my corporate armor. She had spent a lifetime teaching me that love was conditional and transactional. Now that the transaction required my signature, she was horrified to discover I had learned her lesson perfectly. Sylvia let out a quiet, defeated sob. Her shoulders slumped, losing their rigid, aristocratic posture. She turned away from me, walking back toward the center of the room, a broken woman, bereft of her favored son and stripped of her social standing. The emotional maneuver had failed entirely. The matriarch was neutralized, leaving only one final obstacle standing between the Rodriguez dynasty and total ruin. I shifted my gaze down the table, locking eyes with the patriarch, who was silently preparing his very last desperate gambit. Sylvia retreated into the shadows of the dining room, her quiet sobs echoing against the stone fireplace. The matriarch had fired her best emotional ammunition and missed the target, leaving a void in the patriarchal defense. Hector watched his wife crumble. For a fleeting second, he looked like a man drowning in an unfamiliar ocean. Then the instinct for self-preservation kicked in. His lifelong crutch had always been his perceived financial superiority. He had spent 4 decades bullying contractors, threatening local politicians, and dominating his extended family by waving his bank accounts like a bludgeon. He simply could not process a reality where his wealth was insufficient to bend the world to his will. Hector straightened his spine. He rolled his shoulders back, attempting to reinflate his punctured authority. The deep crimson flush returned to his face, settling into a dark, bruised purple across his cheeks and neck. A thick blue vein protruded near his left temple, pulsing with erratic, heavy thumps. He stepped away from his carved chair, ignoring me entirely. He bypassed the daughter, who held the execution orders, and turned his wrath directly toward the man he perceived as the true threat. "You think you can march into my family gathering and dictate terms to me?" Hector snarled, pointing a trembling, rigid finger at the billionaire sitting to my left. Elias Thorne did not blink. He observed the pointing finger with the mild, detached curiosity of a scientist watching a microbe struggle on a glass slide. He opened his mouth to deliver a response, but I raised my left hand, resting my fingertips lightly on the edge of his tailored sleeve. Elias stopped deferring the floor to me without a single word. This was my family. This was my hostile takeover. I am talking to you, Thorn Hector, continued, his voice escalating into a harsh, booming roar that rattled the crystal goblets on the table. You think your private equity firm is untouchable. You think you can freeze my son's assets and walk away. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I own commercial blocks from Burlington to Montpelier. I sit on the board of 3 regional banks. Hector took another step forward, leaning over the white linen tablecloth. His eyes were wide, wild with the desperate pride of a dying king. If you attempt to execute an asset seizure on Apex Innovations, I will unleash an army of corporate litigators, Hector threatened. I will tie Thorn Capital up in appellate courts for the next 2 decades. I will bury your firm in endless discovery motions. I have the deep pockets required to fund a war of attrition, and I will drain your resources until you beg for a settlement. You will not touch my son. The extended relatives held their collective breath. Uncle Ricardo nodded slightly, a faint glimmer of hope returning to his eyes. The aunts and cousins wanted to believe the patriarch. They wanted to believe the Grand Rodriguez Empire possessed the impenetrable armor Hector described. They needed the myth to survive because their own social standing relied upon it. I let his empty threat hang in the air, allowing the false bravado to fully permeate the room. Then I reached back into the open leather briefcase resting between my plate and the red seizure folder. I bypassed the standard acquisition documents and withdrew a secondary file. It was a thick dossier bound in bright yellow cardstock. The color coding was a personal system I utilized for internal investigations. 6 months ago, when Julian first began bragging about his mysterious seed round, I tasked my private forensic accounting team to run a quiet, comprehensive audit on my own bloodline. I wanted to know the exact structural integrity of the dynasty that constantly labeled me a failure. I placed the yellow dossier on the table. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the wood sounded like a gavel striking a block. You do not have an army of litigators, Hector, I stated. My voice was calm, carrying the precise surgical cadence of a medical examiner determining a cause of death. You do not even have a retained general counsel anymore. You let your primary law firm go 3 months ago because you could not afford their monthly retainer. Hector stopped talking. The throbbing vein in his forehead seemed to freeze. His outstretched finger curled inward, dropping slowly to his side. I opened the yellow dossier, flipping past the executive summary, straight to the itemized ledgers. You boast about your sprawling real estate empire. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on the pages. Let us review the current portfolio. The 3 commercial plazas in the Burlington Industrial Park, the residential high-rise in the South End, the boutique retail spaces downtown. I looked up, meeting his terrified gaze. They are all mirages, Hector. You remortgaged every single property you own. You stripped the equity out of your entire life work to fund Julian's initial seed round. You funneled millions of dollars into Apex Innovations through a labyrinth of shell companies, trying to hide the paper trail from the regional banks. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the dining room. Cousin Mateo leaned forward, his mouth hanging open. Aunt Beatrice closed her eyes, resting her forehead against her fingertips, processing the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin. The relatives who had invested their own small savings into Hector's various funds suddenly realized their money was gone. The Grand Patriarch was not a titan of industry. He was a degenerate gambler who had bet the entire house on a losing hand. That is confidential information, Hector stammered, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. You hacked my private accounts. That is illegal. I did not hack anything, I replied, turning to the next page of the audit. I simply purchased your shadow debt from the secondary lending markets. When a man becomes desperate enough to take out high-interest mezzanine loans from unregulated lenders, those notes eventually cross my desk. I own your paper, Hector, and because I own your paper, I know exactly what clauses you signed in your blind panic to save your golden child. I traced my pen down a column of highlighted text. You were so eager to secure the cash, you ignored the cross-default covenants I explained, ensuring my voice carried to the farthest corners of the room. A cross-default clause is a very specific legal mechanism. It dictates that if a borrower defaults on one specific obligation, all related loans immediately enter a state of default. Hector gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning bone white. His chest heaved as the oxygen seemed to thin in the cavernous room. Apex Innovations is the anchor entity for your recent mezzanine loans, I stated, delivering the final, undeniable truth. Julian forged my signature to get the bridge loan, but you used your entire real estate portfolio as the underlying collateral for the seed money. The two are permanently linked. I closed the yellow dossier. The crisp snap of the cardstock echoed the breaking of his legacy. If Julian goes bankrupt, your properties trigger the cross-default clauses, I said. The banks will initiate total foreclosure by Tuesday morning. Your commercial blocks will be seized, your residential towers will be auctioned. The extended credit lines will evaporate. The dynasty is entirely leveraged, Hector. You do not have the deep pockets to fund a war of attrition. You do not even have the funds to pay the caterers standing in the hallway. The silence that followed was profound. It was not the tense, expectant silence of an impending argument. It was the hollow, empty silence of a graveyard. Hector looked at the relatives gathered around the table. He looked for a friendly face, a supportive nod, a spark of residual loyalty. He found nothing but horror and profound disgust. Uncle Ricardo turned his head away, refusing to make eye contact. The younger cousins stared at him with wide, frightened eyes, realizing the rich, powerful uncle they adored was a fraud. The patriarch was socially and legally castrated. His pride, the very foundation of his identity, was mathematically eradicated in front of the audience he valued most. His threats were empty breath. His wealth was a ledger written in red ink. He stood at the head of the table, a broken, hollow shell of a man, realizing he had sacrificed his empire to build a monument to his own vanity. There was no screaming from my end of the table. I offered no triumphant smirk or venomous insult. The cold, surgical application of the truth was far more devastating than any shouted curse. I watched Hector slowly sink back into his carved wooden chair, his spine curving, his broad shoulders collapsing inward. The tyrannical ruler of the Rodriguez family had been deposed without a single raised voice. The destruction of the father removed the final protective barrier shielding the son. Julian stood near the fireplace, shivering in his Italian suit, surrounded by the shattered glass of his ruined toast. He had watched his mother fail. He had watched his father's vast fortune evaporate into thin air. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. There were no more loopholes. There were no more saviors. The golden child was entirely alone, facing a corporate predator who held his freedom in her hands. Julian stood near the grand stone fireplace, a hollow shell, stripped of the unearned arrogance that had defined his entire existence. The protective walls he had relied upon since childhood were gone. His father was a ruined husk, sitting in a carved wooden chair. His mother was a weeping shadow retreating into the periphery of the dining room. The heavy, suffocating reality of federal prison pressed down upon his shoulders, an inescapable weight that finally shattered his lifelong entitlement. His knees buckled. He stumbled forward, reaching blindly for the mahogany surface to steady his collapsing frame. He missed the sturdy wood and crashed heavily into his dining chair. The downward momentum carried his upper body forward, causing his arm to slam against the hard edge of the long table. A sharp, distinct crack echoed through the cavernous space. The glass face of his counterfeit Rolex fractured upon impact. The cheap replica splintered into a spiderweb of jagged lines, a perfect physical manifestation of his fabricated life. The faux gold bezel dented against the hardwood, revealing the cheap base metal underneath. He did not even glance at his wrist. Julian folded his upper body over the pristine white linen tablecloth, burying his face in his hands. A raw, guttural sob tore through his throat. The golden child wept with the unrestrained hysteria of a toddler denied a favorite toy. But this was no minor inconvenience. He was staring down a decade behind bars for corporate fraud. He lifted his tear-streaked face and turned his wet, terrified gaze toward the man who had always fixed his mistakes. Hector stared back with cold, unyielding disgust. Julian pointed a shaking finger at his father. "You did this to me," he screamed, his voice cracking under the intense emotional strain. "You demanded perfection at all costs. You paraded me around your country club friends, promising everyone I was the next tech visionary. You never allowed me to be average." Since elementary school, Julian had carried the crushing burden of the patriarch's outsized ambition. Hector viewed his son as an extension of his own fragile ego, a trophy to be polished and displayed for social currency. When the software startup began bleeding cash, Julian could not admit failure. To fail meant losing Hector's conditional love. So he altered the revenue spreadsheets. He fabricated user engagement metrics. He forged my signature to secure the bridge loan, because confessing the truth to his father felt far more terrifying than committing a federal crime. "You pressured me to be a billionaire," Julian sobbed, his chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. "You made me fake the numbers. I just wanted you to be proud of me. I had to secure the seed money to keep your approval. You drove me to steal her identity." Hector slammed his fist against the wooden armrest, producing a dull, heavy thud. "Do not blame your weakness on my standards, you pathetic coward," the older man bellowed, his voice raspy and thin, lacking its usual booming resonance. "I gave you every advantage. I mortgaged my entire portfolio to build your foundation, and you squandered it. You are a disgrace to this lineage." Sylvia scrambled across the hardwood floor, her high heels clicking frantically. She reached her son, throwing her thin arms around his trembling shoulders, attempting to pull him into a maternal embrace. "Oh, my sweet boy," she cooed, tears carving wet paths through her thick makeup. "Do not listen to him. We will fix this. Mama will figure out a way out of this nightmare." She pressed her face against his suit jacket. Her expensive dark mascara transferred onto the pristine gray fabric, leaving harsh, messy streaks across his lapel. Julian shoved her away with sudden, fierce desperation. "Stop touching me," he hissed, shrinking back into his chair and wiping his nose with the back of his sleeve. "You are just as guilty. You enabled every single lie. You smiled and poured vintage wine while I suffocated under the pressure of your ridiculous expectations. You both ruined me." I sat quietly in my ergonomic seat, watching the toxic family structure cannibalize itself. For 31 years, I had endured their unified cruelty. They had stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable wall of rejection and condescension. Now, faced with the harsh consequences of their own deceit, they turned their fangs inward, tearing each other apart to avoid accountability. I felt no shred of triumph. I experienced no warm rush of vindication. Watching my parents and my brother destroy themselves generated only a profound clinical sense of closure. It was akin to observing a controlled demolition of a condemned building. The implosion was loud, messy, and entirely necessary. I gave them a minute to exhaust their frantic accusations. The extended relatives watched the spectacle in horrified silence, realizing the pristine dynasty they had revered was a rotting facade. Aunt Beatrice offered a slow, solemn nod, acknowledging the inevitable collapse. When Julian's sobs reduced to wet, pathetic hiccups, I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the red dossier. "The asset seizure is non-negotiable," Julian I stated, my voice slicing through the lingering familial chaos with cold precision. "Thorn Capital is recalling the $50 million note. The grace period ended hours ago." Julian looked at me, his eyes red and swollen. He wiped a hand across his forehead, stripping away the last remnants of his aristocratic dignity. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his tone hollow and defeated. "I have nothing left." "I want the immediate surrender of all intellectual property." I demanded, my cadence crisp and unwavering. "You will sign over the proprietary software code, the back-end algorithms, and the physical server hardware. You will transfer the corporate domains and the entire patent portfolio to my holding entity tonight." He nodded weakly, his chin dropping toward his chest. "Fine," he muttered. take the code. It never worked properly anyway. There is one additional requirement I added flipping to the final page of the seizure protocol. This was the exact clause I had drafted personally before leaving my Manhattan office. It was a measure of ultimate poetic justice designed to ensure my brother could never leverage our shared history to defraud another investor. Apex Innovations operates under the umbrella of Rodriguez Holdings Limited. I explained tracing the dense legal text with my index finger. As part of this corporate liquidation, I am acquiring the commercial trademark rights to our family surname. You no longer possess the legal authority to use the Rodriguez name in any business venture, partnership, or corporate registry. Julian blinked his bloodshot eyes, widening in fresh confusion. What does that mean? It means you are stripped of the brand, I replied, meeting his gaze with chilling clarity. If you ever attempt to launch a new company seeking venture capital or sign a commercial lease using your own last name, you will be required to pay my firm exorbitant licensing fees. I own your professional identity. A stunned silence settled over the dining room, mingling with the scent of spilled wine and roasted duck. Uncle Ricardo stared at me, his jaw tight, realizing the true depth of my retaliation. I had not just taken Julian's failing company. I had erased his ability to ever trade on the patriarchal legacy again. The golden child was rendered nameless in the corporate ecosystem. The surname Hector, valued above all else, now belonged exclusively to the daughter he despised. I reached across the white linen tablecloth. I picked up my ruthenium fountain pen. The cool metal barrel rested perfectly between my thumb and index finger. 2 hours ago, Hector had slid a cheap gold pen toward me, demanding I sign away my future to protect his fragile ego. He believed the act of writing my name would be the mechanism of my ultimate submission. I uncapped the pen. The soft metallic click echoed through the quiet space, ringing like a final verdict. The execution was ready. The blue ink flowing from my nib would serve as the definitive instrument of their downfall, formalizing the total eradication of the empire that had tried to crush me. The next stroke would change the landscape forever. The fine gold nib of my ruthenium fountain pen glided across the heavy bond paper. The dark blue ink settled deep into the thick fibers of the final signature line. I moved with fluid, practiced efficiency, signing my name 4 separate times across the seizure authorizations. Each stroke codified the transfer of the tech startup, bringing it firmly under federal corporate jurisdiction. I lifted the pen. I capped the barrel with a crisp, metallic click. I closed the red dossier, smoothing my hand over the dense cardboard cover. I slid the leather-bound files back across the white linen tablecloth toward Elias. He received the documents, securing the twin brass clasps on his briefcase. The sharp mechanical snaps echoed a definitive final verdict through the dining room. The corporate execution was finished. Hector remained slumped in his carved wooden chair. His bespoke navy suit, which had projected such intimidating authority just an hour ago, now seemed to sag around his shoulders like a discarded theatrical costume draped over a shrunken frame. He looked 20 years older. The dark flush of his rage had faded entirely, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were hollow, vacant pits, devoid of their former tyrannical fire. He looked at me across the expanse of crystal goblets and half-empty wine bottles. "Aurora," he whispered. His voice rattled like dry autumn leaves scraping across a cold concrete pavement. The booming, resonant tone of the Grand Patriarch was gone, replaced by the reedy plea of a defeated old man. "How could you do this?" Hector asked, his jaw trembling. "We share the same name. We are your bloodline. How could you destroy your own flesh and blood?" I did not answer him immediately. I stood up, pushing my ergonomic chair backward. The smooth casters glided silently over the hardwood floor. My movements were unhurried, deliberate, and anchored in profound calm. I reached across the table and picked up the beige manila folder. It was the same document Hector had thrown at me earlier. The predatory trap designed to enslave my financial future to his son's fraudulent debt. The heavy cardstock felt cheap and flimsy in my hands. now stripped of its hidden danger. I turned my back to the dining table and walked slowly toward the towering Riverstone fireplace. The large split pine logs crackled and popped, spitting bright orange embers against the heavy black iron grate. The ambient heat washed over my face, melting away the lingering chill of the evening draft. I stood before the hearth, holding the folder over the open, leaping flames. I opened my fingers. I let it drop. The paper fell straight into the heart of the fire. The edges curled instantly, turning a dark, brittle brown before igniting into a sudden bright flash of yellow heat. The dense legalese, the guarantor clauses, the deceptive addendums, all blackened and warped. I watched the predatory contract dissolve into weightless gray ash, drifting up the dark stone chimney, joining the cold mountain night. I watched the final pieces of his scheme turn to cinder before turning back to face the room. I looked directly into the hollow eyes of the broken patriarch. "You did not want a daughter, Hector," I stated, my tone echoing the quiet, steady crackle of the hearth behind me. "You never wanted a child to nurture or protect. You wanted a utility. You wanted a disposable asset to be leveraged whenever your fragile ego required emergency funding." I paused, letting the undeniable truth settle over the silent audience of aunts, uncles, and cousins. They sat paralyzed, forced to witness the ultimate dismantling of the family hierarchy. And as a professional asset manager, I am simply liquidating a bad investment, I concluded. The thematic payoff landed with terminal velocity. The words carried no heat, no shouted venom, no lingering childhood resentment. They were a factual declaration of bankruptcy. I swept my gaze across the stunned faces of the extended relatives. I looked at the cousins who had snickered, the uncles who had looked the other way, the mother who had wept counterfeit tears. "This concludes our transaction," I announced, keeping my posture tall and unyielding. "I am formally severing all ties to this family tree. Do not call my phone. Do not send invitations to holiday gatherings. When the regional banks foreclose on your commercial properties next week, do not look for me to offer a bailout. I no longer exist within your ecosystem. You are on your own." I shifted my focus away from the wreckage at the head of the table. I looked toward the middle of the long dining room. Aunt Beatrice sat quietly, her posture straight, her hands resting elegantly in her lap. She had spent decades enduring Hector's subtle condescension, marginalized because she refused to bow to his grand illusions. She was the only person in this room who saw the truth and rebelled against the charade. Passing me the serving platter when my own mother tried to render me invisible, "Beatrice," I said, allowing a fraction of genuine professional warmth to soften my voice. "Thorn Capital is expanding its philanthropic arm next quarter. We are launching an oversight committee to manage a $200 million charitable endowment. We need a director with impeccable ethical standards and a sharp analytical mind to govern the distributions. I would like to offer you the board seat. The compensation package is highly lucrative, and you would report directly to me." Aunt Beatrice raised her chin. Her dark, observant eyes shone with a quiet, fierce vindication. She did not gasp, act overly grateful, or succumb to sudden tears. She possessed too much inherent grace for such theatrics. She met my professional offer with equal dignity, acknowledging the profound shift in our destinies. "I accept the position, Aurora," she replied, her voice steady, clear, and echoing beautifully across the silent room. "I look forward to reviewing the employment contracts on Monday morning." I offered her a brief, respectful nod. The reward for her quiet loyalty was secured. I turned my attention back to my father for the final necessary stroke. Hector was staring down at his pristine white dinner plate, trying to process the reality of his banishment. He believed he at least had this luxurious mountain retreat to hide within while he mourned the loss of his empire and prepared his son for a federal indictment. He thought he could spend the weekend drinking vintage Bordeaux and hiding from the world. He was mistaken. "There is one final administrative detail, Hector," I said, pulling my dark wool coat tighter around my shoulders. "You wired a substantial non-refundable deposit to rent this property for the weekend. You believed you were leasing a private sanctuary from an anonymous corporate entity. I watched his eyes dart toward me, a new flicker of primal dread awakening in his pale expression. The holding company that owns this Stowe estate is a minor subsidiary of Thorn Capital, I revealed, delivering the last twist of the blade. I personally reviewed and approved your application, and as the acting landlord, I am informing you that your rental agreement is officially terminated, effective immediately, due to a material breach of the morality clause. Sylvia let out a sharp, terrified gasp. The cousins murmured in sudden, rising panic. Uncle Ricardo began frantically checking his pockets for his car keys. You and your guests have until midnight to vacate the premises. I dictated, checking the digital clock on my phone. You have exactly 3 hours to pack your bags. Leave the keys on the granite kitchen counter. If anyone remains on the property after 12 o'clock, the private security team will arrive to escort you off the grounds, and local authorities will be contacted for trespassing. The sheer logistical nightmare of the eviction compounded their ruin. They were stranded in the freezing Vermont mountains, stripped of their wealth, facing imminent criminal charges. And now they were losing their shelter. The narrative pacing within my own mind began to slow. The high-octane corporate warfare was over. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a profound, solemn quiet in my chest. I watched the frantic scrambling begin around the table, but I felt entirely detached from their panic. I was no longer a defensive victim fighting for survival in a hostile home. I was an untouchable force, standing in the ashes of a toxic origin, walking away without a single scratch. I turned away from the grand mahogany dining table, leaving the ruined patriarch and his weeping son to their frantic, desperate calculations. The heavy, suffocating pressure that had greeted me upon my arrival was gone. The air in the cavernous room felt thin and clear. I walked back toward my ergonomic chair, where Elias Thorne stood waiting. The billionaire executive had already gathered the red seizure protocols and the yellow forensic audit dossier. He slid the dense legal files neatly into the divided compartments of his dark leather briefcase. He secured the twin brass clasps. The sharp, metallic snaps echoed through the silent dining room, functioning as a definitive, final period at the end of a long, arduous sentence. We moved in synchronized silence, operating with the seamless, lethal efficiency that defined our corporate partnership. I reached for my dark wool coat draped over the back of my chair. I slipped my arms into the unbranded sleeves, pulling the lapels tight against the chill of the room. The practical garment my mother had mocked just 2 hours prior now felt like the impenetrable armor of a conquering general. I smoothed the fabric, turning my gaze down the length of the table one last time. The extended relatives were already scattering. Uncle Ricardo stood up abruptly, pushing his chair in and whispering something urgent to his wife. He avoided making eye contact with me, hurrying toward the hallway to retrieve his overcoat. Cousin Mateo stared blankly at his pristine china plate, deeply embarrassed by the sudden collapse of his inherited social standing. Aunt Beatrice offered me one final, dignified nod of respect before turning to gather her belongings, preparing to leave the toxic wreckage behind. Julian remained slumped near the stone fireplace, a broken, shivering shell surrounded by the shattered crystal of his counterfeit life. Elias and I crossed the threshold of the dining room, stepping together into the expansive foyer. Our shoes clicked in perfect unison against the polished hardwood floorboards. The towering Riverstone fireplace cast long, dancing shadows across the vaulted timber ceiling, highlighting the sheer absurdity of the rented luxury. The front entrance stood 20 feet away. A pair of heavy oak doors separated the artificial, theatrical illusion of my painful past from the crisp, undeniable reality of my future. Before my hand could reach the cold brass door handle, a figure darted out from the adjacent hallway. Sylvia threw herself directly in front of the exit. Her expensive silk blouse was stained with fresh tears and smeared mascara. Her carefully constructed aristocratic hair was fraying at the edges, framing a face distorted by pure, desperate panic. She spread her thin arms wide, pressing her palms flat against the thick wooden panels barricading our route. She did not look at me. She ignored her daughter entirely, focusing her frantic energy directly on the titan of industry standing by my side. "You cannot do this to us," Sylvia pleaded, her voice a wet, ragged whisper that scraped against the quiet walls of the foyer. "You cannot leave with those documents. You are using her." She pointed a trembling finger at Elias, attempting to weave a sudden, desperate delusion to explain her current ruin. She refused to accept that the child she had marginalized possessed the intellect and the ruthlessness to orchestrate a hostile takeover. Her profound narcissism required a different narrative. She needed to believe a powerful man was pulling the strings. "You saw a vulnerable girl from a wealthy, respected lineage." Sylvia continued her words, tumbling out in a frantic, breathless rush. "You manipulated her to steal our fortune. She is just a simple freelance consultant. She does not understand the complexities of corporate finance. You are controlling her mind, making her turn against her own blood to enrich your private equity firm. Release her right now. Let my daughter go." I stopped a few feet away from the frantic matriarch. I did not feel the urge to raise my voice or correct her absurd fiction. Her inability to acknowledge my autonomy, even while staring down the barrel of total financial devastation, was a testament to her incurable toxicity. She was clinging to the ghost of her superiority. Elias Thorne paused. He did not show a single ounce of anger or frustration. His icy eyes registered pure, unadulterated disdain. He looked at the weeping woman blocking the door with the detached, mild curiosity of a scientist observing a lesser organism. He raised his right hand, adjusting the square platinum cufflink on his left wrist with slow, deliberate precision. The small glint of precious metal caught the ambient light from the chandelier overhead. "Manipulate her?" Elias asked, his tone dropping into a smooth, glacial register that sent a shiver through the warm foyer. He lowered his hands, stepping slightly forward. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you flatter yourself," Elias stated, his voice carrying the quiet, dense weight of a definitive corporate ruling. "Your daughter runs my empire. She navigates complex global markets and dismantles corrupt corporate boards with a surgical precision I could never replicate. She reconstructed the failing European sector for my firm last quarter. She liquidated a fraudulent hedge fund before lunch last Tuesday." Sylvia shrank back, her eyes widening in renewed horror as the titan of industry systematically dismantled her comforting delusion. "She does not possess limitations," Elias continued, his gaze pinning my mother to the heavy oak doors. "I do not control her. I am just the guy who signs the checks she tells me to sign." Elias took a step sideways, closing the small physical distance between us. He raised his right hand and placed it gently upon my shoulder. The touch carried no familiar intimacy, no hidden condescension, and no patriarchal weight. It was a firm, respectful, professional gesture. It was a public, undeniable acknowledgement of my ultimate authority. I stood tall under his hand, feeling a deep, resonant peace settle into my bones. I had not been saved by a wealthy knight riding to my rescue. I did not need a savior to slay the family dragon. I had forged my own sword, studied the dragon's fatal weaknesses, and orchestrated the entire battle on my own terms. My own relentless competence had brought the most powerful executive in the state to my location because he literally could not run his daily operations without my authorization. Elias was simply the herald, confirming my absolute victory to the defeated kingdom. Sylvia let out a quiet, defeated whimper. The stark reality of Elias' words stripped away her final, comforting shield. Her arms dropped to her sides. She lowered her head, stepping away from the heavy wooden panels to clear the path. I reached out and grasped the thick brass handle. I pulled the heavy oak door open. A sudden rush of freezing mountain wind swept into the foyer, instantly clearing away the cloying, suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume and the stale, lingering aroma of the disastrous feast. I stepped over the threshold, leaving the artificial warmth of the rented lodge behind forever. The Vermont night was pitch black, the vast sky dusted with sharp, glittering stars. The frigid air filled my lungs, expanding my chest with a profound, clarifying purity. The heavy, invisible chains of the Rodriguez dynasty dissolved into the freezing mountain wind. The gravel driveway crunched loudly beneath the soles of my leather boots. I walked toward my standard, unbranded sedan parked near the catering vans, moving with the steady, unhurried pace of a victor leaving a conquered territory. As I reached out to unlock my car door, a harsh, ragged shout tore through the quiet, frozen night. Aurora. I paused, resting my hand on the cold metal frame of my vehicle. I looked back toward the sprawling estate. Hector stood on the edge of the wraparound porch. The warm yellow light from the open foyer spilled out around his silhouette, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden deck. His bespoke suit jacket was discarded. His tie hung loose around his neck. He gripped the wooden railing, his knuckles stark white against the dark timber. He screamed my name again. It was a loud, impotent howl, echoing into the dark surrounding mountains. It was the desperate cry of a deposed tyrant, begging his subject to return and acknowledge his shattered crown. He had nothing left to offer, and nothing left to threaten me with. His rage was toothless, empty breath dissolving into the winter air. I did not turn my head. I did not offer him a final glance, a parting word, or a victorious smirk. He was a closed account. I opened the door of my sedan and slid into the driver's seat. I pulled the door shut, sealing out the biting cold wind and the pathetic sound of his fury. The interior of the car was quiet. The silence was deep, rich, and entirely my own. I inserted the key, turning the ignition. The engine rumbled to life, producing a steady, reliable hum. I engaged the heater, feeling the warm air begin to circulate through the dark cabin. I shifted the vehicle into drive. In the rear-view mirror, I caught one final glimpse of the rented luxury estate. Every single window blazed with bright electric light, illuminating the frantic, scrambling figures moving rapidly inside. I could see the relatives packing their bags, pacing the hallways, and preparing for their midnight eviction. The grand, imposing mansion looked exactly like a canceled stage play, the actors trapped on a ruined set, with no audience left to applaud their hollow performance. I pressed my foot against the accelerator, guiding the car smoothly down the winding gravel path. I merged onto the dark, empty mountain highway, leaving the burning wreckage of the financial and social chaos in my rearview mirror. I drove forward into the clear, open night, an undisputed titan ruler of my own destiny. There is a profound, silent tragedy that happens in the quiet corners of certain homes, long before the shouting ever begins. It does not start with a shattered wine glass, a frozen bank account, or the threat of a federal indictment. It starts decades earlier, at a simple kitchen counter, when a parent chooses to brush one child's achievements into the trash to make room for another's fragile ego. The story of Aurora, her brother Julian, and the spectacular collapse of the Rodriguez dynasty is not just a tale of corporate revenge. At its beating heart, it is a devastating mirror held up to the darkest corners of family responsibility. It serves as a haunting cautionary tale about what happens when the sacred duty of parenting is poisoned by transactional love. In American culture, we often speak of the family as a sanctuary, a foundational structure where children are supposed to learn fairness, honesty, and emotional resilience. We emphasize the virtues of hard work and independence. But within the walls of that rented Stowe estate, we witnessed a profound perversion of these traditional values. Hector and Sylvia did not raise children. They managed assets. They built a toxic ecosystem based entirely on conditional affection, losing sight of the fundamental purpose of guidance. Julian was anointed the golden child, but his crown was woven from crushing, unrealistic expectations. By shielding him from the natural consequences of his adolescent failures, his parents denied him the opportunity to develop true psychological resilience. They taught him that his worth was tethered strictly to his ability to project an illusion of success, ultimately driving him to commit wire fraud just to maintain his father's delicate pride. On the opposite end of the spectrum sat Aurora. She was the designated scapegoat, marginalized and ignored, valued only when her pristine financial standing could be harvested to plug the holes in her family's sinking ship. This dynamic is a terrifyingly common corruption of family responsibility. When parents fail to practice emotional awareness, when they refuse to see their children as independent human beings with their own intrinsic value, they sow the seeds of their own destruction. Fairness in parenting does not mean treating every child identically, but it does demand an equitable distribution of emotional safety. By weaponizing their affection, Hector and Sylvia created a home where survival meant learning how to manipulate, or, in Aurora's case, learning how to detach with clinical precision. Honesty is often taught to children as a simple directive: tell the truth about where you went or what you did. But the deeper, more vital layer of honesty is the one parents must practice themselves. It requires the emotional maturity to look at a child without the distorting lens of personal ambition. Hector could not be honest about his failing real estate empire, just as Sylvia could not be honest about her son's deep inadequacies. Their home became a theater of lies, where everyone played a rehearsed role, and the price of admission was their authenticity. When we raise children, our primary responsibility is to equip them with an internal compass grounded in genuine integrity. But how can a child learn integrity in an environment where a father demands a forged signature be legitimized for the sake of the bloodline? The Rodriguez family confused loyalty with complicity. They demanded Aurora set herself on fire to keep her brother warm, wrapping financial extortion in the sacred language of family duty. It is a stark reminder that true family responsibility is never about preserving an artificial legacy or keeping up appearances for the extended relatives. It is about protecting the emotional and psychological well-being of the people entrusted to your care. Long-term guidance requires parents to be the anchor, not the storm. It means allowing children to fail safely, teaching them that mistakes are stepping stones, not fatal flaws that must be covered up with counterfeit watches and fabricated ledgers. If Hector and Sylvia had possessed the emotional awareness to accept Julian's limitations and celebrate Aurora's quiet, steady brilliance, the gathering in Vermont would have been a genuine celebration of a family's diverse strengths. Instead, it was an ambush. The profound tragedy of the Rodriguez family is that their ultimate ruin was entirely preventable. The wealth they lost, the social standing that evaporated into the freezing mountain wind, none of it was destroyed by the stroke of Aurora's fountain pen. It was destroyed years ago by the parents' refusal to love without conditions. They priced their children, and in the end, they could not afford the bill. Aurora walked away an undisputed titan, but the cost of her impenetrable armor was a childhood devoid of genuine warmth. She had to become cold to survive the very people who were supposed to keep her safe. Stories like Aurora's resonate deeply because they force us to confront the uncomfortable truths hiding beneath our own roofs. They ask us to examine the conditions we place on our own love and the heavy burdens we might unknowingly rest upon the shoulders of the next generation. If you found a piece of your own history in this narrative, if you understand the quiet strength it takes to finally walk away from a table where you were never truly offered a seat, then you are not alone. There are thousands of others finding their voice and reclaiming their boundaries. Join our community and follow the channel Linda Vengeance for more true, gripping stories about family dynamics, psychological survival, and the moments everyday people finally take their power back. As the taillights of Aurora's sedan disappeared into the dark Vermont mountains, leaving the blazing rented mansion behind, we are left with a lingering, haunting question. We spend our lives building homes, gathering around dining tables, and telling ourselves that blood is the strongest bond of all. But when the chandeliers are turned off, the elaborate feasts are cleared away, and the illusions of success fade into the night, what truly remains? Are we building sanctuaries of honesty and unconditional support for our children? Or are we simply setting the stage for our own eventual eviction? The answer, much like the quiet that falls after a shattered glass, is something we all must sit with in the dark.